Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this, the 11th meeting in 2014 of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. Can I welcome all members or witnesses who I'll introduce in a second, and guests joining us in the public gallery. And can I remind everyone, please, to turn off or at least turn to silent all mobile phones and other electronic devices so they don't interfere with the sound equipment. We are to be joined later this morning by Bruce Crawford, who's the MSP for Stirling, as an additional member for a later session on Bannockburn Live. Item 1 on agenda, I'd like to welcome Joan McAlpin, who's a new member of the committee, although a very familiar face, having been here as a substitute in the past. And I'd also like to put on record our thanks as a committee to Christian Allard for his contribution to the committee's work over previous months when he was with us. And I would ask Joan McAlpin to declare any relevant interests.
Thank you, Convener. I would refer members to my register of members' interests, and in particular the fact that I am employed by the Daily Record newspaper to write a weekly column. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Item 2 on the agenda is a continuation of our inquiry into Scotland's economic future post-2014, and we have 2 panels of witnesses this morning. I'd like to welcome our first panel, and we're joined by Bill Scott, Director of Policy at Inclusion Scotland, Dr Catherine Trebeck, who is the Policy and Research Advisor at Oxfam GB, and Peter Kelly, Director of the Poverty Alliance. Welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us. Now, we are a little bit short on time this morning because we have got a lot to get through as a committee this morning. So we're going to allow probably about 75 minutes or so for this opening session. Can I remind members, therefore, if they would be keep their questions short and to the point? That would be very helpful. It'd also be very helpful if they could direct questions at a particular member of the panel, rather than just generally to all 3. Now, if you would like to come in and respond to a question addressed to somebody else, if you just catch my eye, I will bring you in as time allows. And if we could keep the questions as short and as focused as possible, that would be very helpful in getting through what I'm sure will be a broad range of topics in the time available. We've had written submissions, I think, from some of you, which will be very helpful in understanding your position. I think rather than therefore ask you to make opening statements, because we've got the written information, can I maybe just start with a general framing question? Maybe start with you, Catherine Trebeck, just get your perception on this, and then perhaps bring in the others. There's a lot of debate around issues around poverty, inequality, in this debate around Scotland's constitutional future. One of the claims we often hear made is that the UK is the 4th most unequal country in the world, or sometimes qualified as being the developed world. Looking at some of the writing in this area, John Rentoul, who writes for The Independent, I'm sure you'll be familiar with, has written quite a lot about this, who says that in terms of income inequalities, the UK ranks 28th out of 34 OECD countries. But in terms of wealth inequalities, we rank 14th out of 34 within the OECD. And over the past decade, income inequality has in fact been reducing, probably as a result of the recession. I'm interested just to get your take on that starting point. Do you think it's important when we have this debate that we frame it with accurate information and not, fairly wild assumptions?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's all too many myths swirling around issues of welfare reform, poverty. I mean, the Strivers versus Skivers is a false dichotomy, is a case in point in the myths, and it's sometimes often blatant propaganda. So keeping to facts is crucial. The point you make about income versus wealth inequality is also really crucial. A couple of weeks ago, Oxfam published a report identifying that 5 families in the UK own as much wealth as the bottom 20% of the population. And that's in terms of wealth. And that shows you the dire extremes of wealth inequality. And so talking beyond income inequality, which a lot of people, I suspect, understand, to actually wealth, which can be much more hoarded, but also opens up much more different mechanisms for taxation and policy activity as well, is important. I suspect my colleagues will probably have comments on that.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, I think, again, we would start by agreeing with Catherine that, yes, we have to have accurate figures, and there will be different interpretations of some of those figures, but we need to start with an accurate assessment of the levels of income and wealth inequality. But just to back up Catherine's point there, it's a fundamental issue, and we have seen some diminution in inequality over the period since the recession, but I think the extremes of wealth and income inequality are stark in the UK and in Scotland. And I think it's not simply the existence of those inequalities that are important, it's the impact of them, it's what they actually mean for people living in Scotland and living in the UK.
On that last point, Mr. Kelly, I mean, David Iser, who I'm sure you'll know from Stirling University, who's coming in to the panel just after yours, has said in his submission to us that income equality in the UK is high relative to international comparators, but this is largely the result of the London effect. There are a lot of very wealthy people live in London. It's a world city. Inequality in Scotland is roughly average compared to OECD countries. Would you think that's a fair analysis?
There's no doubt that London has a significantly distorting effect on the UK economy, and it will have an impact on those inequalities outside of London. So yeah, that's accurate.
Except average is still actually quite bad. When you think of the last 20, 30 years, inequalities across the developed world have got worse. In our submission, in our report that we published last year called Our Economy, we highlighted the fact that there's a 273 times, that's the ratio, the wealthiest in Scotland to the bottom. Now, that ratio for the UK is 500, but 273 is still pretty unequal. And so I think it's a matter of, yes, we may not be as bad as the London effect would take the UK, the place that the London effect would take the UK into, but we're still a terribly unequal country. And when you add into that the growing health inequalities, this stuff is really translating into life and death situation.
Mr. Scott, do you want to add anything?
I mean, very little to add, apart from that disabled people, in terms of income inequality, are even worse off than the average in the population. They're almost twice as likely to be living in poverty as an adult who's not disabled. So the disparities that Catherine's referred to in Scotland, expand again for disabled people within that society. The average disabled person is likely to be significantly worse off.
Okay, I'll hand over to Dennis Robinson.
Thank you and good morning. Really following on from the first question, and obviously we're trying to establish the factual aspects, and when we're looking at the inequality aspect, do you see the referendum as an opportunity for change, for instance? And if so, I mean, where would you like to see that change take us? What pathway do you think we should be going in terms of trying to readdress the inequality? Because I think, when we read the Oxfam paper, we've been looking at this since about 1975, and basically inequality is there. Every government since then has failed to address it. Do you see the referendum as an opportunity for change? Catherine, maybe.
It won't surprise any of you to understand that Oxfam has no official position on the outcome of the referendum. But what we're in no doubt into is that we need radical change in how we do the economy in Scotland. And what's, I think, exciting about the referendum is that it's opened up a discussion across Scotland about what sort of country we want to be. You're probably aware of our Humankind Index that has actually had really fallen into that space quite fortuitously and contributed to that discussion about, is this a country where we want to continue to have the extremes of inequality that I mentioned 273 times, the wealthiest to the poorest, growing health inequalities, the rise of in-work poverty, zero-hour contracts, the dire rise in food banks. We need no further indictment into the fact our economy and our social safety net is broken than the rise of food banks. And so I think what's been positive, regardless of whichever outcome one might be seeking, is the debate that this has spawned. And I think that's really important, and hopefully that we'll be able to capitalise that in whichever scenario we found ourselves in on the 19th.
Yeah, we, like a lot of organisations, civil society organisations, voluntary organisations, have been having this kind of debate for a long time about the kind of economy that we need, the kind of social safety net that we need, the kind of social security system that we need. And I think what the referendum September has done has allowed that conversation that sometimes has gone on, unfortunately, with too few people and too few individuals and organisations to be spread out much wider. So the Poverty Alliance's initial contribution to the referendum debate was in September 2012. I think we published a discussion paper which was all about setting out questions for all sides in the referendum debate, and we've taken part in many discussions since then. Our Scottish Assembly for Tackling Poverty last year featured quite heavily debates around constitutional change. Like Oxfam, we're not taking a position, but it has been an opportunity for discussions like this one today to take place, to say, well, what is it that needs to change in Scotland?
Mr Scott, obviously in the world of people with disabilities, do you again see this as an opportunity for change?
Yes, I think everybody agrees that the debate surrounding the referendum does provide an opportunity to try and work out what sort of Scotland we want to live in the future. Probably what sort of Scotland we would like to live in the present, not too far in the future. No, but we don't have a position because disabled people are diverse in their views as non-disabled people, and we wouldn't want to divide them one from the other on that issue. We'd leave them to make up their own minds on it. But there is definitely an opportunity here. Disabled people have been campaigning for independence longer than the party in government because they want to live independently in the community and be part of mainstream society. And that is a goal that can be raised during the referendum debate and to see how all sides respond again. Are you in favour of disabled people playing a full part in society? And if so, how can we achieve that? What sort of Scotland do we need to achieve that? So whatever the outcome of the referendum, I think those questions are still going to be there, and if we've discussed them during the course of the referendum, we might be somewhere closer to an answer after the referendum.
Current barriers at the moment then for progressing that change?
There are massive barriers still in terms of the stigma surrounding disability, which I think has become worse in recent years because of some of the rhetoric around the strivers v skivers debate that a lot of disabled people have been wrongly described as not wanting to work, when in fact the barriers to them working are, there's all the physical barriers, transport not yet being fully accessible, buildings, many buildings still not being accessible, and just not receptive employers in a lot of workplaces to the idea of disabled people being there. I think, again, the referendum might create opportunities to have a discussion with employers about the skills and experience that disabled people can bring to the workplace. So many of them don't get the chance to exercise the skills they acquire.
Any other issues or any points to make about barriers that's with regards to inequality that we have currently? No?
I'll come in. If we're thinking about barriers around economic change, I think Bill has already mentioned the labour market and the way that our labour market currently functions, and the way that people are able to access or not access our labour market, the way that they're able to remain in our labour market, and the rewards that they receive when they are in our labour market does present a significant barrier to reducing inequalities, reducing income inequalities, and addressing poverty. I think members will know that The recent statistics are showing that in-work poverty is one of the key causes, has become now one of the key causes of poverty overall. So I think the way that our labour market functions is a barrier, and in reference to the start of the question, which was around the referendum, regardless of the outcome of the referendum, that will remain an issue about how does our labour market function, what are the policies required to make our labour market work in a way that's better for those who are currently at the bottom of it.
And I think I'd quickly, just briefly, because it's quite, it could take us into huge uncharted territory, but I'd add to that, actually, that the extent of the current economic orthodoxy, the push to economic recovery, rather than trying to build back a better economy, I think is a barrier as well. Just going back to business as usual is not good enough, because it didn't serve us well enough prior to the recession. And so in aid situations, Oxfam's mantra, for example, after the Philippines tsunami and typhoon, the mantra is always build back better. We should be applying that to the economy right now, rather than trying to recover the old model that didn't serve us well enough. It didn't reduce poverty to the extent we needed to. It certainly didn't reduce inequality, and it didn't bring down health inequalities. So we need to move away from that faster recovery, become this faster economic growth, and think about actually trying to build back better, create a better economy that does address those inequalities head on.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm sure we'll explore some of these issues in more detail. Margaret McDougall.
Peter Kelly mentioned there about the in-work poverty, and I think this is an issue, along with others, that stresses the poverty and inequalities within our society. Do you think that the living wage, for example, would assist in meeting that and addressing that inequality?
Absolutely. The Poverty Alliance was one of the organisations that established the Living Wage campaign in Scotland in 2007, so we've been strong supporters of that for a long time. And the reason why we adopted the Living Wage campaign was that people who we talked to who were living on low incomes, who were either in work or out of work, kept telling us that things just weren't working for them. They weren't able to make ends meet when they were in the labour market. And I think the work that's been done around the living wage undoubtedly helps individuals lift themselves out of poverty, but it also sets out, I think, a different way for our economy to work. It begins to set a different agenda for the relationship between workers and employers, and begins to set out what a different role for employers in our economy is. That it's not just about profit, it's not just about growth, but actually there is a real, genuine social responsibility there for employers, and that's expressed by them in paying the living wage.
Along that, if we're talking about a living wage, I mean, we should be grasping every opportunity that we can to try and increase this in the future. And I mean, personally, I think that the procurement bill would be a way of adding that opportunity. If I could move on to sort of inequalities and what we're doing around what's happening around the welfare reform. If there was an independent Scotland, what levels of taxation would be required to support a welfare society or a welfare service that would actually reduce the poverty and inequalities?
Well, I mean, if you reduce in work poverty, you wouldn't have to spend as much on your welfare bill. I mean, that's one of the lessons that we can take from a living wage. Actually reduces the amount you spend on universal credit or housing benefit, etc., because the person gets it through their wage packet rather than from the state.
So living wage is crucial then.
I mean, there's a number of measures, and disabled people I mean, going back to living wage, why disabled people's organisations support it is because so many disabled people are unemployed or workless, but the ones that are in work, there are only 2 in 5 disabled people in Scotland in work just now of working age, compared to 4 out of 5 non-disabled people of working age in work. But the ones that are in work are often in entry-level jobs that pay minimum wage. So the living wage is very, very important. Yes, probably a higher level of taxation might be needed, but collecting the uncollected taxes would go a long way towards creating a more supportive welfare system. I think the other thing that we should begin to think about is how we spend social care money to support the welfare system. Does life and limb cover to disabled people enable them to participate in the labour market? I don't think it does. It doesn't allow them to attend college necessarily. It doesn't allow them to volunteer and acquire skills and experience that they can take into the labour market and compete with non-disabled people. So we should be thinking about a welfare system that does more than just be a safety net, that actually supports people to fulfil their potential in society. And if it did that, you'd spend less on healthcare because people who have good well-being and feel that their lives are worthwhile tend to use the health service less. That's a fact known in health inequalities. Every study of health inequalities shows that if you can increase well-being, increase people's feelings of self-worth, then you can reduce your health budget. So yes, you would probably have to have a higher taxation regime. I'm not a tax expert. I'm not a fiscal expert. But there are ways to reduce your overall health and welfare budget through spending money investing in people rather than just acting as a safety net to catch them when they fall out of the labour market or are prevented from entering the labour market. So I think we need to think creatively, whether in an independent Scotland or not, about, again, back to what sort of society do we want. And if we want people to participate and have feelings of self-worth, we have to allow them to take on roles and responsibilities that they want to, but currently are prevented from doing because the state doesn't support that sort of activity at the moment. At the moment, if you do too much voluntary work and you're unemployed, you're told you're not fulfilling your job-seeking conditions. And I, as somebody that's worked in the voluntary sector for 25 years now, I've got colleagues that I started with who were volunteers, who are now directors of voluntary organisations. It's a tremendous route into employment, and yet we're not supporting people to do it. I think we need to rethink what we're about in terms of giving people the support that they need to succeed, and as ourselves as a society to succeed.
Yeah, I think I absolutely build on Bill's point there, that actually it's not so much the levels of taxation outright, though of course we should certainly be collecting all the taxes due and levelling things like the Robin Hood tax to undermine speculation and raise tons and tons of money for welfare here and support for people around the world. That should go without saying. But I think it's beyond a discussion around outright levels of taxation. And unfortunately, I don't carry many statistics around in my head, but one of the few statistics that does stick in my head is from the Christie Commission, that 40% of local government spending is due to what they called failure demand, remedial spending, because we failed to fix people's lives in the first place, due to inequality. And if you start to track through this idea of creating a healthy society, creating an economy that we can build back better, where we can have an economy that supports people in the first place, and you track that through to a logical conclusion, actually you're potentially talking about smaller levels of tax, because we're keeping people healthy in communities, so we don't need to spend expensive money in accident and emergency, in the court system, etc. So I think I'd urge you to sort of broaden that line of discussion around what sort of economy do we require that will help people live good, healthy, fulfilling lives where they're not requiring that sort of failure demand spending to intervene at the end stage, which is always more expensive because it's judges, it's expensive, highly paid consultants in hospital rooms, etc., rather than perhaps the less glamorous work of community health workers, etc.
Alison Johnson.
I'd like to direct my questions in the first instance to Mr Scott and then to Dr Trebek. It seems, to date, the economic arguments for and against independence have mainly focused on the prosperity of the nation as a whole. Do you think we still have an opportunity to influence those undecided people by perhaps looking at more specific aims? Mr Scott, in your paper, you suggest that inequalities can increase while overall improvement occurs. And the examples you give of, that we can increase the proportion of young people in learning, training or work, but that might have no impact whatsoever, or perhaps even a negative impact on young people with disabilities. And you also speak about the care charging. I was fairly astonished to read that although millionaires are only paying 45 pence in the pound, the marginal tax rate imposed on disabled people by the care tax can exceed 90% of their income. Do you think if more attention was given to these issues, if there was more awareness raised as part of the debate, we might see, who knows, some change in the polls as we go forward?
I honestly do. I think it's a great unknown that, that care charges have grown over the years and they are increasing faster than the rate of inflation. And for disabled people, they have an income, and I do know personally people who are paying over 90% of their income coming into the house in charges going out, and there are people who have retired, medically retired from work in their 50s, have a significant pension. It's practically all taken back by local authority in charges. We don't have that sort of debate in society about the level of taxation, because that is what is to a disabled person. That they pay their normal taxes, income tax, etc., council tax, and then an additional charge is placed on them for their daily care needs. And yet, if that person was in hospital, we would think it was an obscenity if they were being charged for their daily care needs in that way. So, I do see the referendum as an opportunity to have that sort of debate about, why is it that disabled people are placed in that position in our society? And if we want to change that, how much would it cost? How could we do it more effectively, etc. Actually, care charges don't raise a lot in revenue in terms of the overall care budgets of local authorities, but they are seen as a way of at least generating some revenue when other options are at the moment closed because council tax is frozen. I think we could get into a debate about what forms of local taxation, etc., might be less regressive, and provide that, again, services that we really need. Because one of the problems is the fees itself the council tax fees can be regressive, and it's lower income people that rely on council services more. But on the other hand, if the council tax is raised, it will be a barrier to people going into employment, because as soon as they step into employment, they will be asked to pay more. So we have to look at how we can come around to a form of local taxation that is less regressive and doesn't penalise people in low incomes as much. Because the current ratchet effect for the council tax basically means that if you raise it at all, people in low incomes are going to be paying a significant portion, much more than those in higher incomes, as a proportion of their income.
Mr Scott, you mentioned in your paper that at the moment the UK welfare system is geared to one outcome, placement in the labour market. And Dr Trebek, you pick up on the fact that, well, I think you both do really, that work is no longer a guaranteed route out of poverty. And indeed your paper points out that 700,000 people in poverty in Scotland, and 280,000 of those people are actually working. Are you surprised that this issue isn't receiving more attention as part of the debate? And, you know, my colleague mentioned the living wage earlier. Surely that is an issue that should be having a much higher profile, because obviously, you know, it could be transformational in terms of taxes collected and in terms of, you know, simply lifting people out of poverty. Why do you think the debate has focused on several issues fairly narrowly to this point?
I don't have strong views in terms of interpreting why the debate has gone in one particular direction. But to answer your question, surprised, perhaps devastated, actually, that the debate isn't talking more about the quality of work. I mean, I remember several years ago having a conversation with your colleagues in this committee about how we measure employment and unemployment, and actually the messages from the Humankind Index are that we need to dig beneath those fairly bland figures to look at quality of jobs that are being created. It's not good enough to say that more people are in jobs if people are having to, if they're on 0-hour contracts, if they're in secure jobs. So we know from conversations that we had around the country for the Humankind Index that people don't necessarily want loads and loads of money. What they want is sufficiency of income, security of income, and a suitable job. Now, that's a very different job to the precarious sort of work that's emerging at the moment. And so we need to have a much more sort of rich, more nuanced conversation about the type of work, and maybe turn our attention to creating a measure of decent work. And perhaps there's a conversation to be had about what would be entailed in that decent work. I'm constantly using the phrase around the office, the tyranny of averages. And I think if we're just looking at those mean levels of per capita GDP, for example, the prosperity of the nation as a whole, we won't dig beneath that to see who's being left behind and what sort of conversations we need to have and what sort of policy prescriptions we need to put in place, what sort of changes we need to ask of business behaviour, etc. So and I guess it goes back to the original question that opened the session about what sort of evidence do we need. We very quickly need to dig below those headlines, not just about bland employment figures, it's not just about GDP per capita, it's about ultimately what sort of country. And again, to come back to the Humankind Index, which I know you're all familiar with, that showed us that while the Humankind Index itself was tracking up at very slowly at a sort of national level, when you compared deprived communities to Scotland as a whole, there were gaps in a whole range of different aspects of people's lives. And so this is what politics is about. It's messy, it's hard work, but it's about delving deeper and having that conversation. And so I think it does come back to that original question about finding the right appropriate facts that we're looking at and not just settling for bland headline figures or being misled by averages.
I just want to mention Alison Johnson's question, because obviously she rightly referred to care charges for people with disabilities, which was rightly highlighted by Mr Scott in the inclusion submission. But given that these are issues relating to local government and to do with local government funding, rightly local government taxation, well, certainly we can have this debate as part of referendums, and it should we should be having that debate anyway, whatever the context, over our approach to these key funding for services at a local level, which are already within the bailiwick of this Parliament.
Can't disagree with that. I mean, there are powers that the Parliament has at the moment that could address some of these issues. I think there are other ones, because of the interaction of various welfare benefits with earned income, etc. Unfortunately, are out with the powers of the Parliament, and it would be difficult for the Parliament to address some of the barriers at the moment. In terms of care charges,
local taxation, that's all.
Yes, definitely it could be addressed. At
Simply the point.
Right, okay, thank you. Chick Brown.
Thank you. Good morning. 3 days last week I was in London and Thames Valley area, and I have to echo the comments made by Dr Trebek about nothing has changed. House prices in London rising by 70% in 18 months, and those in a particular area, and there are pockets of poverty in London itself. It appears that nothing has changed. And in that context, we talked earlier about the UK ranking 28th out of 34 nations in the OECD on measure of overall inequality. Can I ask all of the panel, do you believe that inequality has been properly addressed by Westminster governments? And do you believe, if there's a no vote, do you believe it will be addressed in the future?
Let's repeat the question. So the question is, have Westminster governments effectively addressed inequality until now? Well, the answer to that is no, they haven't. Could they effectively address it if there is a no vote? And I remind the panel that, not the panel, the members that the Poverty Alliance doesn't have a position. Would they? I think your question was, would they address it if there was a no vote in September? Well, there would be nothing to stop them addressing inequality post a no vote. That that these things can be addressed. We've been arguing, Poverty Alliance has been around for more than 20 years. We've always argued, before there was a Scottish Parliament established, that we need to do more to tackle inequality. This isn't a new argument for us. And wherever powers sit in the future, we'll need to argue that choices need to be made to effectively address inequality.
No, again, inequality certainly hasn't been sufficiently addressed by the current configuration. Whoever party is in power across Westminster here and at local authority level as well, because they all have a role to play. I think the sort of received wisdom seems to be that in the sort of early part of this century, the inequality was sort of held back slightly because of policy changes, which shows that policy does work. Policy is important, but we see now that some of those policies are being eroded. One example of what's the sort of changes that could happen now is the which I also keep on my desk, the National Performance Framework, and the current target around reducing income inequality. From memory, and I'm a little bit rusty because I've changed jobs since paying deep attention to this, is largely focused just at the bottom end of the income spectrum. So a change that we'd be urging with the current situation to be adopted would be to cast the gaze across the whole income spectrum, because the communities that we work with are constantly saying to us that poverty is about wealth. It's about people, it's about riches. It's not about just people at the bottom of the income spectrum. It's about the whole of society. And so changes like that to ensure that we don't just focus on the bottom, but understand that it's the whole of the income spectrum. And in our written evidence, we've suggested consideration of things like maximum wages, earnings ratios, etc., to sit alongside the work that the living wage will do in terms of raising people up from the bottom. So it's, yes, this is, living wage is life-changing stuff, and it's vital and important, but it's only the first step, and we need to go beyond that to look at the entire spectrum.
I don't think that Westminster's done enough to tackle inequality, and I don't think actually even in Scotland we've done enough to tackle inequality. We've done things which have tackled inequality in the past. But sometimes, and my training was originally in statistics, and as anybody could tell who read my submissions, but there is a failure sometimes. It's going back to, I'm going to steal Catherine's phrase, the tyranny of averages, that when we see an improving trend, we tend to think that we've tackled the problem. So we've had rising life expectancy in Scotland for 2 decades now. But we've also had rising health inequalities. And people don't really understand how that can be. And the fact is, the way that happens is that you improve the life expectancy of those at the top faster than you improve the life expectancy of those at the bottom. And it's the same with employment. I think the Scottish Government have got a lot to be proud of in terms of managing to keep unemployment relatively low within Scotland compared to other parts of the UK. Unfortunately, at the same time as relatively high employment levels have been maintained in Scotland, the rate of employment of disabled people has been falling, right? And that's missed within that average. And that's a worry that we have, that even in the sort of economy that is being created, there seems to be less place for disabled people in the workplace. And I think that we need to examine why that might be occurring. Is it because of the move to more digital forms of service economy, etc.? Is that acting as more of a barrier than before? Are the loss of places like Remploy, etc., not being filled? Because the idea is that we move people out of these sort of places and move them into mainstream employment. But are we moving into mainstream employment? All those sort of questions. In other words, we need to dig deeper if we're going to understand inequality and tackle it than just the headline figures of how many people are in work or and things like that.
I think I agree with that. And unfortunately, we don't have the time to drill down and look at some of the things. I mean, I'd like to talk about cooperatives and involvement and young people and things like that. But my question about, and clearly you agree that we are where we are because those that controlled the funding and the policy have failed. I mean, I'd like to ask in Oxfam, Dr. Trebek, in your report, in your response to the UK budget, that the welfare cap is, and I quote, hardly something to be applauded, unquote, and that the Chancellor's commitment to helping the poorest in the UK is questionable. All parties, all the main parties in Westminster agreed that there should be a welfare cap. What do you think will be the long-term impact? On the assumption there might be a no vote. What will be the long-term impact of the UK government's welfare spending cap, particularly on low-income families? Does the cap not, in effect, lock in the UK government's welfare cuts?
I think it's always going to be better to respond to the long-term impact about the cap, but at a very sort of gut reaction. I mean, it's completely separating delivery of according to people's need and replacing it with delivery according to some spurious political priority. And that's a really sad indictment of where we've got to at the moment, because sometimes people's needs might cost a little bit more, and we need to be prepared as a society to help them with that. I think Bill will probably have tracked through the modelling, perhaps, I don't know, further than I have. But for Oxfam, it's a matter of principle, actually, that if people need support, we're, 6th, 7th richest country in the world, we should stand ready to support them as needed.
Yeah. I mean, we're spending less in terms of GDP on welfare now than we were spending in 1992. It's not that it's become unaffordable because we're spending more on it. It's that as a political grouping in society have decided that we're spending too much on that and we should spend it on something else. In other words, choices have been made about the level we spend. I am worried about the welfare cap. Once you create a cap, it can be lowered as well as raised. And in other words, the principle is a dangerous thing that's been introduced. And I completely agree with Catherine that the problem is that there are billions of pounds in unclaimed benefits every year. If, as a response to the welfare cuts that are taking place, the Scottish Government and local authorities invest in welfare advice, etc., and manage to get more people to claim the benefits they're entitled to, the cap will act as a barrier above which spending cannot rise, and there will have to be cuts to benefits. So it doesn't make a great deal of sense, because it will deprive those in most need of support from the support that they need, and that's just wrong morally.
Just follow that up with in the briefing paper that we had, looking at the reasons for growing inequality. There was a comment that David Eisler's and Professor David Bell's research found the main drivers of inequality to be disparities in pre-tax income or market earnings. doesn't, in the case of a yes vote, doesn't that new government, new constitution, new policy making give us the opportunity to create one tax oblique welfare system so that the credits can apply, so that we don't have this multifarious mechanism of trying to balance welfare credits against tax revenues? Wouldn't it provide us with the opportunity to create one cohesive tax oblique welfare system?
Maybe, potentially, but I mean, the fact remains, I think there's lots that can be done now, and I suspect that's not what the discussion you wanted to get into. But I think there are lots of levers that are currently available now. I mean, yes, the idea of simplifying the tax and welfare system is exciting, but we'd be urging that right away to the Westminster government. I think if we're looking at pre-tax earnings, things like, you come back to things like living wage, things like type of jobs that are available, things like who is getting those jobs, how they are shared, how inclusive they are, people who have been out of work for a while included. So, and all those are things that the levers are currently available. So I think there's lots that can be done now.
Sorry to interrupt, but in your excellent paper, one of the things when you're looking at your fiscal policy is talking about the application, enforcement of tax and tax avoidance, which is not under the will of the Scottish government. I mean, in terms of the proposals, these surely are out with the remit of the Scottish government to control. I mean, 32 to 120 billion pounds is lost in tax avoidance and tax evasion in the UK. That's appalling on the basis of what we're talking about today.
So not that I want to make up Oxfam policy on the hoof here. I get in deep trouble when I go back to the office. But coming back to Margaret mentioned the procurement issue earlier, perhaps we could start saying, well, as Scotland, we're not going to procure from any company that is found to be tax avoiding and evading. Perhaps we're not going to support certain businesses, not mentioning any names, but there's one that starts with A and ends in an N, that we know is one of the blatant culprits in terms of tax evading and tax avoiding. And so again, it comes back to there are levers that can be addressed now.
Very briefly, but we've had a fair crack at it.
Reference PIPs, the personal independence payment. Has that been a positive step, Mr. Scott? And what has been the experience of disabled people in its implementation so far?
No, not so far. In any case, and not likely to be. It's always been designed to achieve a 20% reduction in the amount spent on supporting disabled people. So, as a consequence, a lot of disabled people of working age, because pensioners are exempt from the new assessment process, and as are children, a lot of disabled people of working age are going to lose their entitlement either entirely or partially. So, but at the moment, there are tens of thousands of people who have not yet had an assessment, and the introduction has been very, very badly handled by the companies that have been given the contracts to deliver it, Capita and Ethos, and they simply don't have enough people in place to do the assessments. And we're exceptionally worried about people in remote and rural areas of Scotland who have been basically told that they won't get an assessment until such time as there are sufficient people in their area that merit somebody coming out to see them. If you live in Skye or the Western Isles, I could imagine that could be quite a while. There are thousands of people that have been waiting over 6 months. So there are a lot of problems there, and implementation of new benefits always difficult, always more difficult than governments imagine. There are a number of things about universal credit that probably Peter, Catherine and myself all agree it is a simplification. It could potentially achieve benefits as a system. The problem is, to achieve it, a lot of people in low incomes are actually going to see a reduction in benefit rather than an increase. To make work pay is to make not being in work even worse than it is at the moment. And you can go for a better system, but you need to think through the consequences of what you're hoping to achieve.
Okay, thank you. Well, we need to move on. We're getting a bit behind the clock, so I'll bring in Mike McKenzie.
Thank you, Convener. I just wonder, you know, what I was struck in reading your written submissions by was my impression that what you're describing are long-term problems, deep-rooted, profound problems that are structural in nature. How optimistic are you, given the realpolitik of the situation, that George Osborne is promising continuing austerity, austerity plus, Ed Miliband's promising to match that, but just to do it slightly differently, and that the whole political centre of geography down south is moved to the right because of the resurgence of UKIP? How optimistic are you that we're going to see any real change to the awful situations that you describe?
It's my turn again. I mean, I'm not a political commentator, and I'm not going to give you estimations of what I think election outcomes are going to be in the future, because anyone who knows me will know that I'm notoriously bad at guessing what election outcomes are going to be.
With the greatest of respect, I'm not asking you to guess that. I'm really, you know, I'm really describing a kind of scenario that I think few people would disagree with. I'm not asking you to call the result of the next UK election. What I'm saying is, whatever the outcome of that election in 2015, do you really see any change in terms of the circumstances that you've described in your written submission?
Well, the current government, so the policies that are being acted, if we look only at welfare changes, then we would say, no, these aren't addressing the structural systemic problems that we would see in our welfare system. Do I know if that's going to change in 2015? I don't know. I don't know. And I can't really guess the prospects. You know, we're a non-political organisation, so I'm not going to comment on what I think the political changes in other parts of the UK might mean. But in terms of the current policy direction from the current UK government, then they're not addressing some of the issues that I think you alluded to. And just to come back on one issue, because I didn't get the chance to comment on it, is around the welfare cap, which I think colleagues have already criticised it. I think in terms of the policy choices that we make, it's one of the ones that's possibly the worst in my view, because a lot of our welfare changes, and Bill has just mentioned that we could possibly be supportive of universal credit because it's a simplification, it's about easing the transition back into work. So a lot of our welfare changes are predicated on getting people back into work, making the system work more effectively. The welfare cap doesn't do that, and it's not even intended to do that. Not a single person will be helped back into the labour market because of the welfare cap. Now, those kind of policy choices are the wrong ones. So at the moment, we're on the wrong course in terms of the policy direction that Mr Osborne has set out for us.
Okay. Any of the other panel members like to comment?
The only thing I would say is somebody that's looked at history quite a bit, things can change very rapidly. I think somebody better than me once said a week's a long time in politics. A year or more can be a long time in politics as well. Very rapid change can come about. Sometimes social movements bring about rapid change. And you know, there is, I think, in Scotland at the moment, quite something of a social movement around about the issue of the referendum, whichever side you're on in the debate. I think there are people interested for the first time in many years in politics again. And I think that's quite hopeful, because if politicians do them the benefit of listening to the sort of society that the people who've been disengaged and are now re-engaged in politics again, the sort of society they want, then I think it would be a step forward. Now, that can only be transformative maybe within Scotland, but it could actually have a wider knock-on effect throughout the rest of the UK in terms of, you know, re-engagement with a group, I think, in society that have been largely written off, and that's, you know, that's the people on low incomes, who political parties have, I think, assumed would vote for one party, you know, forever, and it's not turning out that that might be the case. Yeah. So I'm not a political commentator either, but as I say, things happen, movements occur, and things change more rapidly than people can sometimes imagine. I'm hopeful that things can change for the better. I agree with Peter, if the current direction the policy is pursued, the structural problems are not going to be addressed and we'll be in the same place. But I think there are possibilities.
You wouldn't care to comment?
A bit anxious about this. I mean, I think the reality is that there isn't a articulation of a whole-scale change to an economic model that I would describe as offering us this idea of building back better. I mean, I haven't read in depth the white paper, but a very quick scan of that suggests that it is a very similar type of low road, all about faster economic growth, exploiting the oil fields when our environment won't be able to handle that, etc. I think so. I'm yet to see a really fully articulated radical alternative from. And if that's the scenario we're looking at, then we need to do a lot more work in terms of what opportunities there are offered by independents. Well, that's open for another conversation. I think to pick up, I think the part of the background to your question was around short-termism, and it's something I completely share, you know, a discomfort about. I think a lot of our problems today are undue focus on short-term, whether that's by business or by politicians as well. And I was talking to Peter on the way over about some really innovative work that's being done in the state of Oregon in the US around 10-year budget cycles. Really, and that's where you start getting government departments joining up together. You start to get this panic over attribution and different year-to-year budget pots. And I think there's a lot of lessons around really taking this idea of preventative spending that in the UK, Scotland has pioneered and really made its mark on. And I'm constantly referring colleagues down south to the work on preventative spending here, but I think that's a basis from which we can go a lot further if we're really serious about that upstream prevention that prevents the harm happening in the first place. Yeah.
I mean, that neatly leads on to my next and final question, Convener. I'm just asking you to end on a kind of aspirational note, be aspirational, and imagine that, you know, whichever way you feel we ought to vote, assuming that we did vote yes, the people of Scotland, and so you're in charge of the new Scotland. You've got all the levers at your control. And you know, assuming that you don't want to just put sticking plasters on the problems or paper over the cracks, you really want to see us move in a better direction of travel. I'd invite each of you just to say, what would you do, given all those levers of power? Be aspirational.
If you could
give us some advice.
If you want to answer this question, please do so very briefly, if you would.
If you're wanting us to point to sort of top three policy changes, I mean, we're in an incredibly complex situation. That's always very difficult. In terms of favourite policy ideas, which is not the same as perhaps the most, you know, the key ones, I'm really compelled by the idea of earnings ratios out in whatever institution. I'm really excited by the idea of rather ugly, I call, pro-social business models. Beyond just purely extractive, for-profit, faster short-term shareholder value, but things like cooperatives, social enterprises, benefit corporations, etc. So there's two as a start.
Invest in people. It's the greatest riches that we have in our society, and I do that at UK or a Scottish level. Say that I see the wasted potential of so many people in our society, not just disabled people, but those living in our poorest communities. And if you could unleash that potential, then you'd have a genuinely rich society that anybody would want to live in. And I think that would be my aspiration, is begin to invest in those people and unleash their potential.
In a similar vein, to devolve power to communities and to genuinely empower communities to take control of their individual lives and their communities to bring about change. I think that's how real change happens, and that's the kind of change we would want to see.
Marco Biaggi.
Perhaps a question for Dr. Trebeck. How familiar are you with the collective bargaining approaches that are taken in some European countries as a sort of alternative to the formal minimum wage? Because it struck me that in all the talking about the living wage, there are different ways of getting it. You can either have the legislation that sets it out, or you have the system where I think is present in 7 of the 9 Western European countries with the lower inequality, whereby there are national collective bargaining agreements that are then enforced through law. Is that something that you've looked at in your international studies? And if so, do you have a view?
So I'm not an expert, but what I do know is that they're part and parcel of a much wider system of partnership between businesses, trade unions, and government bodies as well, and that's quite a different way of doing things. In terms, and which I think there is boundless scope to learn from in terms of Scotland as well. I think also to go back to the sort of economy that we've got in Scotland, it isn't particularly conducive to that as well when we're talking really an atomisation of the labour market. People on very insecure 0-hour contracts, a huge rise in the levels of self-employed people who used to be part of a labour force working for an employer are now branching out on their own because they're not getting those paid jobs. And so you're talking very, very serious challenges to get to that stage, to be able to do that sort of wide-scale collective bargaining. In terms of how it could bring forth the idea of the living wage, I mean, it's a terrible, terrible situation where the state is subsidising employers that are paying chief executives in the millions but are apparently too tight to be able to pay their staff living wages. And so we need to start to look at those businesses, and supermarkets have been ones that have been identified in the past as clearly having enough money to pay their chief executives, massive amount of money, but apparently not having enough to pay their staff. I think, again, the lever of procurement is an obvious one. But there's all sorts of other mechanisms. I understand Ecuador has this idea of a dignity wage. I don't know loads about it, but they say to their businesses there, we're not going to force you to pay the living wage, but you're not going to be allowed to pay out dividends to your shareholders until you do. And it comes back to this idea of what's in the idea of, what's affordable, what can you undertake. I think then, if you're talking about affordability, that for businesses that are deemed, I don't know, the Resolution Foundation's done a lot of work on this, apparently not able to afford to pay the living wage, then we're going to say it's okay for their staff to continue to live on poverty wages. And I don't think that's good enough. So we need to come up with a collective solution if we want that particular business to stay in operation. But Peter's much more an expert, so I might pass to you. The buck. Yeah, the buck.
Yeah, I think Unite, the union, had a proposal a couple of years ago around sectoral bargaining, which was looking at ways of spreading the living wage and by different means, really. I guess it's not dissimilar to procurement. And we're also part of the European Anti-Poverty Network, and I know the network at the moment is doing some work around different approaches to establishing living wages in different countries. But I think Catherine also mentioned the importance of, if you like, those tripartite arrangements, and that's a tradition that we don't have here, I think. And if we look to, we often in these kind of debates look to the Scandinavian countries, and that's where some of those tripartite approaches are well established, and it's part of the cultural way of doing business and reaching negotiated agreements. And I think if we're if we're about transforming our economy and the way it works, then it is about recognising that it's not simply about business and business leaders that make economies work. It's organised labour, it's unorganised labour, it's the third sector and so on.
It is interesting that the countries that adopt that model, include Germany and Austria, really do strike me as the ones that haven't just prospered in equality terms. They've also, in the last 10 years, in the face of the challenges, been the ones that have done the best in orthodox economic terms as well. But to ask a slightly adjacent issue, one of the other things that really is the hallmark of these economies is their gender participation and the ability for women to enter the workforce, especially compared to the UK. Is that something that you think could have a material impact on poverty? And is childcare one of the things that would be a useful step in that direction?
Just very briefly, I think the sooner we start seeing childcare as part of an active labour market policy regime, the better. It surely must be one of the most simple solutions in terms of, one, an employment creation, but also an employment enabling. And in terms of good quality childcare as well. And so how we pay the staff who are providing that childcare, the location, the creativity, etc. I mean, I'm not an expert on childcare, but I just think that if there's any easy wins, childcare's got to be up there.
Yes, I would agree. The other question, and it's slightly going off your topic, but one of the things that we also have to remember is that a transformation of our economy is not simply about employment, and we've focused very much on employment and the quality of jobs and all that kind of stuff. That's vital, but we have to remember for many people, accessing the labour market isn't an option. Either in the short term or in the much longer term. So we need to think about when we're thinking about future our future economic system, how it works for those people as well who aren't able to participate either in the short or long term. And I've just remembered that Germany, I think, has just introduced a national minimum wage as well, which is an interesting development, just as an aside to your earlier question.
Of national minimum wage, you'll be aware that the minimum wage in this country has fallen behind inflation, and one of the things that the White Paper says it'll do is redress that. Is that something you would welcome?
I think the need for above inflation increases in the minimum wage is unquestioned. One of the reasons why we made progress in addressing in-work poverty in the first part of the last decade was that we had consistently above inflation increases in the minimum wage. That effectively stopped after 2004-2005, and that's why we've not made much progress since then. And again, I think in terms of Mr. Bayaji's last question about the gender dimension, above inflation increases in the minimum wage were one of the reasons why women in particular were lifted out of low-paid employment in that, to a greater extent, in that first part of the last decade.
I suppose that's a very clear illustration of a power that the Scottish Parliament doesn't have at the moment, that if we had, could address poverty.
Yes.
No one should be working for their poverty.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Richard Baker.
One question, fine convener. Obviously, no one can be satisfied with levels of inequality in our society. I actually support for the devolution of welfare powers, but isn't there a danger in seeing constitutional change in itself as a panacea? We had the discussion around local government funding, for example. We've got a proposal in the white paper to cut corporation tax. You saw mentioned some other potential low-road approaches. You mentioned Dr. Trebek. And I was interested in your comment that we've seen inequality in terms of income and wealth as a problem across the whole developed world. I mean, is it not the case that some of these discussions are going to have to take place on an international and global level, not even just within the framework of a debate on Scotland and the United Kingdom?
Absolutely. I guess I come to this debate and my thinking about it from my perspective that I grew up in Australia, where there is similar, I guess Australia in a way is in a very crude sense, that's sort of the direction that Scotland seems to be talking about wanting to go, though we've kept the monarchy, as you'll probably see all too well in the current media at the moment this week. But the case of Australia shows that independence is not enough. It's not enough. I mean, it may be part of the story, it may not, but there are much bigger forces. And if you're building an economy that you still kowtow to corporate interests, that you still focus on a very narrow type of economic competitiveness, and if it is about recovering that business as usual model, then we won't be doing anything different at all under any sort of constitutional arrangement. And so I think we need to really be exploring, being much more creative with the future we're describing, whichever way we settle the independence debate on the 18th.
Okay, can I just ask, we've got 3 minutes left, can I just ask Catherine Trebek one more question? You were talking earlier about the need to clamp down on tax avoidance, which I think we would all agree with. In the budget a few weeks ago, the Chancellor, George Osborne, announced a specific measure to clamp down on what are called bareboat charters in the North Sea oil and gas sector, which is a well-known tax avoidance measure used by international oil companies. Is that something that you welcomed, and do you think it was right that that was condemned as a measure by the Scottish Government?
I'm afraid it's not something I know much about, but I could try and dig out Oxfam. If Oxfam commented on that measure, I could try and dig that out and forward that to the clerk.
But as a general approach, you welcome measures to clamp down on tax avoidance?
Absolutely, absolutely. As long as they're genuine and not yet creating more loopholes. And I think that there has been some criticism of some mechanisms over the past 18 months or so, that there's been a lot of very good rhetoric about clamping down, and actually the mechanisms that then come into fruition are just opening up yet more loopholes or not going far enough, etc. But I'm far from an expert in it, other than being pretty disgusted by the extent of it. Yeah. But I can check out, I can find if Oxfam's commented on that and forward the response. Yeah.
Okay, I think that draws us to the end of our time. Thank you all very much for coming along. Thank you for answering the questions, and particularly for keeping to time. That's been very useful. We'll now have a very short suspension to allow a changeover. Right, if we can reconvene, we're continuing our inquiry into Scotland's economic future post-2014. I'd like to welcome our second panel this morning. We're joined by Dr Jim McCormack, who's the Scotland Advisor from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Morag Gillespie, who's Research Fellow at the Scottish Poverty Information Unit at Glasgow Caledonian University, and David Iser, Research Fellow at University of Stirling. Welcome to you all. I'm obliged to you for coming along, and thank you for your written submissions that you've provided. We are a little bit tight for time this morning, although having said that, we did extremely well in terms of the first panel actually finishing dead on time. So I hope members will take that as a precedent to continue for the second panel. We're aiming to run this for about 80 minutes, aiming to finish, if we can, by about 11:45, or maybe just slightly before that, if we can. So I remind members, if they would, to keep their questions short and to the point, and if we could have answers that is short and to the point, that would be very helpful. And I would ask members, if they can, to direct questions initially to perhaps one panel member, and then if you would like to come in and respond to a question addressed to somebody else, that'd be quite helpful. If you could just catch my eye, and I'll bring you in as time allows. I wonder if I could start off by asking a similar question to the first question I put to the previous panel, which is around the way we frame this debate around inequality. And I think we all recognise there are great challenges in terms of equality, in terms of either income or wealth, affecting not just Scotland, the UK, but the world as a whole. I was interested to read, Mr Eisner, maybe I could direct this to you initially. First of all, in your submission, you make reference to the fact that inequality in Scotland is roughly average compared to OECD countries. In the UK, the figure is impacted by the London effect, because London is a world city with presumably with a great many people of extreme wealth, which skews the figures. John Rentoul, who writes for The Independent on these issues, has said that in terms of income equality, the UK ranks 43rd out of 156 countries in the world. In terms of the OECD, we rank 28th out of 34 countries. But in terms of wealth equality, the figure's better. We rank 14th out of 34 countries. And over the past decade, we've become less unequal as a society. When we sometimes hear people make statements like, oh, the UK is the 4th most unequal country in the world, is it helpful to the debate to have these rather wild and unsubstantiated claims made about where we are with inequality, recognising that we do have challenges? Mr Iser?
Well, I think we need to interpret those kind of rankings with some caution. I mean, the figures about the UK being 4th most unequal country in the world tends to exclude a number of other OECD countries where data doesn't exist. So, I mean, there's an immediate first problem in terms of saying, well, the UK is 4th most unequal. But nonetheless, I think it's useful as a first step to sort of get a sense of, I mean, yes, there are global factors that are influencing inequality across the world, but I think there is still a very strong role for policy in influencing inequality, and looking at how trends in inequality compare across countries is certainly a very useful first step to understand how effective policy is in the UK relative to other countries and what else we might do to address inequality.
I'm sure we'll want to explore a few of these issues in the course of the questions. Jim McCormack, do you want to comment on this?
Only to say that we've done some work some years ago looking at public attitudes to economic inequality, and a bit to our surprise we found that the public are more interested, more concerned about economic inequalities, especially in earnings, than they are about poverty, which has been most of our focus in our work. So economic inequalities matter. People are probably willing to consider a broader range of policy responses that we've seen traditionally coming from political parties. And in terms of, our focus has tended to be what that means for people at the bottom where you might say there's a globally downward pressure on wages and returns to labour for where people have aren't highly qualified. So in a sense, what we've been trying to do in the UK in the last 20 years is climb up a down escalator for people at the bottom end of the jobs market. What that misses out, though, are trends at the top. And you can't try to understand poverty, inequality, what's happening in the economy without looking at the relationship across the whole of society. And I think that's where we've had consistently a blind spot across the UK.
The point I would agree with the comments that have been made so far, and I think the point that I would want to add is that one of the things that enables the UK or Scotland to be in all these different positions is that one can use an infinite number of definitions of inequality just as one can about poverty, and my shelves are groaning with the arguments about which definition is appropriate for what. And as David said, you have missed data, you have different qualities of data gathering as well. So therefore it is possible for the UK to be in different places. I suppose the thing that strikes me from all the stuff I've looked at is it is consistently at the wrong end of it as far as I'm concerned. It is never at the good end. It is never at the same edge of the graph as countries like Finland and Denmark and Norway. It is always much closer to Singapore and the USA. So, so whatever definition you use, the UK tends to show a degree of inequality for a rich nation. I mean, it's much less unequal than lots of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but that's not where we should be looking. And I think the other point I'd like to make about definitions is often most of what we judge and most of what we assess is based on the household. And the household, as a unit of measurement, can hide very big inequalities within households. Particularly the position of women can be underrepresented in our assumptions about what happens within households. And it's not an easy task to untangle that, but it is also not useful to always ignore it because it's difficult.
Okay, so I think what you're saying is this is an inexact science.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
The short answer, correct.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, Dennis Robertson.
Thank you. And perhaps I could direct my first question to Maura Gillespie. Over the many decades, the inequality agenda is definitely there. And I think we have seen, various, today's government and previous Westminster governments maybe sort of trying to tackle it on the fringes. Do you see the current referendum, because this is what our inquiry is looking at, the current referendum as an opportunity for change? And if so, in what direction do you think that change should be going?
Oh, I've been arguing with others for many years for changes to the way we approach poverty and inequality. I think over the last couple of decades, we've focused more and more on the poverty end of things, and indeed poor people, and individualised the issues around poverty, sometimes in quite an extreme way nowadays, which people seem to be accepting more and more. And I think that's a huge concern, both in terms of public attitudes, but also in what politicians say and what newspapers write and so on. We focus much less, as Jim has pointed out, on the exponential growth in high wages and the huge growth in wealth in our society, and I think we've done that at a cost. So I welcome any opportunity which opens a stage for a debate about how we could do things differently. And I know this has been said before, but the one thing that is for certain sure was if we were all sitting around the table inventing a new system of social security and income security and work, we certainly wouldn't invent the system that we have just now. None of us would. I mean, let's be perfectly honest, we wouldn't invent that system. Therefore, what I see the referendum as being is an opportunity that actually hasn't come up in the last 20 years to sort of sweep everything aside, with the potential to sweep everything aside and start with a new sheet of paper. Whether it's Devo Max or whether it's independence, almost is less important than the freedom of mind that it brings for people to think outside the tram lines that we've all been struggling with for all these years. And it has to be said, we've been tinkering at the edges of a system that doesn't work. The fact that most people in poverty are in households where someone works is testament to a system that doesn't work. Trying to do it more efficiently in Scotland, I doubt is going to achieve much other than tinkering at the edges of the figures that we're dealing with. And for me personally, that's not good enough aim. So I want to look at different ways of doing things. Other countries in the world do it better. Let's try and learn from them a bit.
Regardless of the outcomes, basically, we've got the opportunity for change.
Yes.
Okay. Anyone else want to?
Anyone else want to come in? Jim McCormack?
Yeah, happily. So our starting point would be to say that there's more we can do within current powers and budgets, despite the limitations of the settlement, around tackling poverty. That said, if we want to do things differently, chart out a different pathway, be more effective in responding to the different needs across Scotland, so the different regional and local housing and job markets that exist across Scotland, then a different settlement will be needed. More powers will need to come to Scotland under whatever constitutional change that may be. And worth declaring an interest in the sense that our Chief Executive, Julia Unwin, is contributing to the Independent Expert Group on Welfare and the Constitution, not because we take a position on the referendum, we don't, but because if there were to be a yes vote, we want to contribute to trying to help shape what might be a reformed welfare system. And if it's a no vote, our hope would be all the thinking and analysis and time that's gone into that working group will bear fruit under, for example, further devolution, even if it's on an uncertain timescale. So that's kind of our hope and the way in which we're trying to approach the referendum, seeing it as an opportunity, probably our best opportunity within the UK at the moment, to rethink from first principles how to have a more effective jobs market, housing market and social security system for the times we live in, and then try and fit that to whatever constitution we find ourselves with in future.
Okay. Two members want to ask supplementaries. First Chick Roddy, then John.
Just for clarity, because I asked this question first panel. Are we saying that there is an opportunity in a new constitutional settlement to produce one integrated tax and benefit system?
If you want. To me, the point is for me that makes some sense. After years of arguing for and defending the value of a contributory-based system, in other words, social security, rather than a residual welfare system, which is what we're increasingly moving towards, in my own opinion, where much more is means-tested, rather than contribution-based benefits being part of the system, as Beveridge had once intended that contributions were the cornerstone of the system, and in fact means testing was really residual at the margins, and it didn't work as our society changed somewhat. But yes, I would say that a lot of the complexity and the inconsistencies that come into the current system potentially can be removed with a well-thought-through integrated tax and benefit system. But that in itself is not enough. I think that the key thing is that you need to have all the key policy areas pointing in the one direction towards common aims. If our aim is to reduce inequalities, then economic policy, industrial policy, labour market policy, housing policy, social security and taxation, all of those, along with education and training, childcare policy, all of these things need to work towards that common aim. Now, there's lots of other issues in amongst that, But what we have just now are, to some extent, these policies being developed in silos, and they can work against each other. You have conditions for benefits which are not necessarily to do with means testing or contributions. You know, housing benefit, for example, can be about where you live, how many people live in your house, how many people were in your family 5 years ago but have now left the house. You know, what area you live in determines, particularly in England, how much help you get with council tax and so on. A system that's like that makes it impossible to really understand the implications of any changes at all. So coherence, and it also makes it much more difficult for people to claim what they're entitled to. And I just take the opportunity now to point out that there's far more underclaiming of benefit entitlement than there is benefit fraud, both of which are dwarfed by tax evasion and tax fraud.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. John McCall.
Convener. Yes, this is for Morag Gillespie as well. You talk about the opportunity for Scotland to start afresh with independence. Looking at the trajectory of the main UK parties who are likely to be in government post-2015 and the consensus in Scotland, do you think that we need independence in order to have that change of direction, that fresh start that you anticipate?
I don't know that I can really answer that. I think what I can say is that there is potential with control over more areas, whether that's through independence or some sort of different settlement, for Scotland to do things differently. What wouldn't work, in my view, would be, for example, if Scotland had control over social security spending, but not any of the other areas around that which are crucial to getting a system which works with those other aspects of policy rather than things working against each other. So I think there's a danger, for example, I read some work by the Institute for Public Policy Research, which is arguing that certain types of welfare benefits should be devolved to Scotland, but others should remain at the UK level. I have to say that personally, I think that down that route is chaos and no clarity, and the most difficult sort of circumstances for people to be able to claim any entitlements that they may have. So that they may have. So I think there has to be some coherence to the policies which work together. And I appreciate there's a political process that's going on to decide that. But I would also make the same arguments about the social security system, and have over many years, and about the level of the national minimum wage and all of those things to whoever will listen to me on the subject at whatever level of government, to be honest. I think we have an opportunity here because of the debate in Scotland, but I can't argue that one outcome is necessarily inevitable, because it depends what the politicians decide. In the end, Scotland, an independent Scotland, does not necessarily mean that we will have the sort of things I would like an integrated tax and benefits system. It just means an opportunity to debate that, which may make some changes.
One of the anti-independence parties, the Labour Party, has already unveiled what its offer is in the event of a no vote. What's your response to that? My position would be to continue to argue for the policies that I think will reduce inequalities and poverty. Am I totally convinced that any of the parties are necessarily taking exactly the position that I would advocate? Probably not. So I would simply continue to advocate those policies. I'm not in a position to argue for one political party or another, to be honest.
Okay, thank you. None of the other panel want to comment on that. I'll just bring in Martin McDougall.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. Obviously, and from what we've heard already this morning, it's a very complex issue around inequalities and poverty, and if it was easy to fix, it would have been done already. And I think Morag Gillespie has touched on that by saying we're just tinkering around the edges. But what could be done? What could be done now that, you know, we've spoken about the living wage, for example, this morning. What could be done that we're not doing now? And also, Maura Gillespie mentioned that other countries are addressing it much better. If you could maybe expand on that a little bit and just say what other countries are doing and what would be the cost involved in that. Well, I don't mean specific figures, but, you know. Maura Gillespie, if you could.
I think Jim will also have things he'll want to say. I think one of the things we get wrong that, for example, the Nordic countries do a bit differently. Just to give you a couple of examples. There are two areas where I think we've used the benefit system in a way that hasn't been wholly effective. You know, if we decide to subsidise, or how we decide to subsidise, say, for example, housing benefit and childcare, as two examples, determines how things play out. Now, it's being argued now that, for example, our support for childcare through tax credits and through the various other initiatives that are there is actually helping to increase the cost of childcare. It's having an adverse effect on the actual childcare market, if you like, the cost that people have to pay. Whereas in countries where the investment in childcare is in the actual delivery rather than subsidising people to pay for it, is actually proven to be more effective and doesn't increase the cost in the same way, so it makes it more accessible to people who are poorer. Similarly with housing benefit, part of the argument about the cost of housing, the escalating cost of housing benefit, is that housing benefit itself has helped to drive up the cost of housing. And we do have a serious problem in Scotland, not to the same extent as the rest of the UK. We have a serious problem with the cost of housing. If ordinary low-paid workers cannot afford to live in the home that they rent, we have a serious problem. We need to tackle that problem with the most urgency, rather than simply trying to use an ever-increasing housing benefit system to pay for what? You know, private landlords' profits. I'm not sure. You know, even in public housing, the costs are growing and growing. Housing has to be affordable for ordinary people. And if people are going to live in low wages, and it's going to be a long road to change that, if people are going to live in low wages, then we need to make the housing affordable, not just use the benefit system to actually, in effect, increase the cost, not necessarily without seeing the benefits.
Obviously has a big
and it is how you respond to that. There are, I mean, I'm not saying you must do one instead of the other, but I'm saying that the balance of those things has to be right. And I think there's an increasing view that I'm seeing where we need to put more investment actually into the childcare and the housing and tackling the affordability of those, rather than just using a not very good benefit system to try and prop it up, when in fact what we're doing in the end is just increasing the costs.
I would agree. I mean, under any system, you know, we need intelligent governments that know how to procure services in the marketplace, how to hold down costs and drive up quality. And the argument Morris just made on housing and childcare, you could also make, as was made in the first session, on subsidising low pay, and where does the balance of costs lie between the taxpayer and the employer, for example. So over time, we need governments which will shift that balance. So, for example, with more powers, you might want to spend less on housing benefit over the next 10 years and more on housing supply to boost supply, hold down costs, and so on, which is good all round, I think, as well as employment multiplier effects. But your question was also about within existing powers, and one thing we've done at the end of last year was to look at the child poverty strategies of the 3 devolved countries and look at how their different and limited powers are being interpreted and used. And one of the challenges, I think, for Scotland, well, 2 challenges would be, number one, taking faster action to close the attainment gap in schools. I think we're complacent about our attainment gap in schools, actually. It's big, it's persistent. Kids in the bottom 20% in Scotland are performing at the same level as Turkey, at the lower end of the pack in OECD terms, and that's, in terms of longer-term prospects, longer-term earning potential, longer-term poverty risks, that's a very big issue, which we could do more about now. And the second would be around adult skills, where I think we've also been complacent since devolution began. So your chances of getting on-the-job training in the workplace, if you already are poorly skilled, are only 1/3 the chance of those who have significant skills already. So what we're doing in our workplaces through our public investment in training, employers' own investment, and to a smaller extent what individuals spend on their own skills and training, is widening the gap over time and widening the gap in earning potential over time. And I'm not suggesting for a second we have the power to change all of that at the moment, but there's substantially more we could do within current powers and budgets on those fronts if we made closing the gap our main focus rather than simply improving broad averages and improving overall attainment.
I would agree with all the points that have been made, I think. I mean, in terms of the question about what can we do to address inequality and poverty, I mean, I find it useful to think in terms of three broad areas. There's taxation and personal benefits, which we've already talked on a bit. And most of those things, of course, at the moment are reserved. The exception is council tax, and some reforms could be made there that could improve inequality. The second area is in terms of what you might call wider public services spending on non-cash benefits. So that's the kind of things that Jim was just talking about, and I would reiterate what he was saying there in terms of education spend in particular, and also health spend. The education spend is a really critical thing in terms of addressing inequality and intergenerational inequality, given that ultimately the underlying drivers of inequality are around changes in the demand for skills and how well we meet those changes in demand for skills. There is evidence at the moment that the graduate premium, the graduate earnings premium, is continuing to increase. Even though we've got an increase in supply of graduates, the returns to graduates to graduate qualifications are continuing to increase. Moreover, and this is perhaps contradictory to what you might expect, there's some evidence that there is a skewing over time so that it's actually people from better off households and families that are more likely to participate in higher education. So you take those two things together, higher returns to education and a skewing towards greater participation among higher income households, we're actually at risk of passing on some of that earnings inequality from one generation to another generation, and that's going to inhibit social mobility. So that's some education stuff. Of course, education inequalities start at a young age. We probably could be doing more in terms of addressing educational inequalities at an early age. In England, there's pupil premium now, a £900 supplement for disadvantaged pupils. I'm not quite sure to what extent we've got a similar level of progressivity of education funding in Scotland at the moment. So that's the second sort of bunch of areas is public spending. So there's the tax and benefit stuff, the public spending, and then the third area, again, which is largely reserved rather than devolved at the moment, is what you might call labour market interventions. And that can include anything from stuff around minimum wages, living wages, but there are things that can be done in terms of encouraging their uptake and use at the moment, right through towards sort of looking at 0 hours contracts and things. So I find it useful to think in terms of those three areas, and within each of those three areas there are things that can be done within the existing devolved settlement. Not everything can be done at the moment with the settlement, but some things certainly can be done.
Could I just add a very quick point about the current settlement? One of the areas that I and colleagues in Women in Scotland's Economy Research Centre have looked at is the Modern Apprenticeship Scheme, which is really the flagship programme. Now, there is loads of room for improvement particularly in relation to occupational gender segregation in the modern apprenticeship scheme. And whilst the actual numbers of women involved in modern apprenticeships is improving, if you just look below the surface of that, they're being involved in a very occupationally segregated way. They're much more concentrated in the lower level apprenticeships, which last longer, give them lower qualifications, and of course lower earnings potential in the end. Now, this is true of the apprenticeship schemes across the UK, but it is an area where Scotland could do much better to try and tackle the really quite extreme inequalities that are there in terms of access to jobs. And on the one hand, and this is where things need to join up, on the one hand, the Scottish Government is supporting the Close the Gap scheme, which is about tackling pay inequalities between men and women and occupational gender segregation. But at the same time, the modern apprenticeship scheme is gaily just reinforcing what's out there in the wider labour market. So it's a good example where there is plenty of evidence of what could be done. Not saying it's easy, but there is progress that could be made there.
Okay, thank you. Alison Johnson.
Thank you. I'll direct my first question to Morag Gillespie, if I may. The debate so far has focused largely on the prosperity of the nation as a whole, and you know, you were pointing out earlier how even looking at prosperity within a household sometimes wasn't terribly helpful. And I think from the earlier panel too, we've sort of been made aware of the dangers of our obsession with the average, because so many people aren't average. And I'd just be grateful if you could elaborate a bit on your comment regarding a citizen's basic income. It's certainly a policy that my own party is very supportive of, and Professor Ailsa Mackay, spoke in Parliament not too long ago on this issue. It seems to me that we're potentially missing an opportunity to look at things afresh and come up with a system that works. And I believe that even previous UK Conservative governments considered this, quite fully. So why aren't we making any progress on this area?
Yes, I mean, Ailsa, I have to put my hands up and say Ailsa Mackay, my good colleague and friend, was the expert on this subject. I'm a supporter in principle, but without her depth of knowledge. It's something we're working on some projects now, so my knowledge will improve over the next couple of years. But I don't have her depth of knowledge. But I think that I think there's growing interest in the citizens' basic income as an alternative to the systems that we have. Because, as I said earlier, if we all work on the basis that no one would invent the system that we have today, and if we really don't think the kind of complexities of the kind of contributory-based system we had, which was based very much on a male breadwinner model of households where women stayed at home and men worked. Do you know, that kind of structures was set up for a time when that was the norm. But now, I would argue that you need to take account of family formation, however it is, whether it's lone parent families, of which we have many, whether it's couple families, whether it's single people, singletons. We just have to take account of people in all of their diversity and have systems which don't exclude them. And one of the beauties of a basic income is that it in many senses is able to do that. It is also the easiest way to integrate benefits and taxes, in as much as at its core, the principle is that everyone, whatever they do, they get the basic income, and then one pays taxes on all of one's earnings. At the most basic, that's pretty much the principle of what it involves, and therefore it means that everyone gets the benefit. I'm not saying there aren't issues to resolve. The cost of disability and housing are big issues with a basic income, but to me, you've got one has to look carefully at something which puts more of the resources into giving the money to people rather than funding a complex administration, which immediately becomes a barrier for vulnerable people to claim, which is what we have with the kind of means-tested systems. There isn't an efficient, low-cost means-tested benefit system. As soon as you introduce means tests, it becomes complex and people don't claim. So there's lots in my mind to commend looking at citizens' basic income. It can be partial and it can be full. You know, there are, as I say, there are others with the expertise who can take you through models and how they might work and what one might get for the current social security bill, for example. That can all be estimated. But what it does is recognise that paid work is not the only thing that matters. And we can't kid ourselves that it's the only thing. It's the only thing we seem to focus on often is employability and work. But unpaid care work, volunteering, and for some people just surviving from day to day is good and it should be valued. When we have a GDP which treats construction as investment and childcare as leisure, we've got a problem that needs to be sorted. And this is consistent with that because this says everyone's contribution matters. And in fact, when people are freed up from trying to work out whether they're better off in work or not, because they always are, then it actually makes moving into work easier. And actually, it enables people to take risks as well. That, you know, those are some of the arguments for it.
Thank you for that very comprehensive answer. And obviously, it's women who are, well, I think they're suffering terribly from some of the impacts of austerity, and it's women who provide so much of that unpaid care. I don't think I need to ask Dr. Jim McCormack for his views on that question, but can I just go back to what you were saying about educational attainment and the fact that you're concerned that there's complacency around the attainment of some of our children. Now, obviously, if you're in a house where there's no access to books, where for whatever reason your parents aren't reading with you, or no one's doing your homework with you, or you're going to school without having breakfast and who knows, possibly even dinner the night before, it's obviously very difficult for our teachers to address that challenge too. So what is it that we need to do to help level that playing field? Because this isn't just about education, is it?
It's not. It's a very good way to frame it. I think, which comes first? Is it education? Is it poverty? Is it low inherited skills? And so on. One thing that is worth saying, though, that if you look at low-income families across Scotland, there are quite substantial variations in how children from those families fare in terms of formal qualifications, which is only one way of measuring attainment. It's too limited a way of measuring it, but it's where we've got the data. So there are important variations across Scotland, which is to say that some authorities do better for poor kids than others. If you track back to what we know about the early years, as well as doing a much better job of investing in high-quality preschool education, supporting the home learning environment is where the evidence is strongest, and it's where we do the least. In other words, supporting families and their know-how around quite simple things that help children to develop literacy skills earlier and keep on track. Homeschool partnerships, which are genuinely about co-production and understanding families' aspirations. All these kind of things are where the evidence is very strong, but where we put very little investment, and we continue with, I think, the myth that long-term curriculum reforms or reducing class sizes or other bits of the system are the most important route to closing the attainment gap. I think the evidence suggests that those are not the most important route. And that the other things are much more everyday and relational, and every single school and community can take action, even if it's much easier to make progress against the backdrop of a much lower poverty rate than we have at the moment.
Okay, Chick Brody.
Good morning. I wonder if I may ask Mr. Isa, in your submission, you said many commentators expect that inequality will begin to increase soon as economic recovery combines with the UK government's welfare reforms. There are some, and I'm one of them, who believe that the economic recovery is a mirage and is based on debt. I mean, is that how, when you arrived at this, what was the basis of you establishing, in your mind, what the economic recovery was in real terms?
So I think since the start of the recession, there is evidence that inequality fell, but that's really because real incomes fell by more than benefits did. We're now starting to see, I think for the first time very recently, we've seen an increase in the average real income. Now, admittedly, that's including benefits, including bonuses, sorry, in that. So, yes, you could debate to what extent we're seeing a real recovery at the moment, but I think we're definitely seeing the beginnings of a recovery, and even without any policy change, you would expect that to begin to lead to an increase in inequality again, particularly given the fact that many benefits are now being frozen in cash terms in some cases, or being uprated by 1% a year in some cases, combined with various other things around benefit caps and so on. So I think that was the basis for saying that we think inequality will begin rising again, and I think the evidence from the IFS is that we'll probably, by 2015, be back at a level of inequality that we saw pre-recession.
Again, my colleague Alison Johnson mentioned averages. How much of that has been, this economic recovery, do you think is impacted by the huge earnings increase pre-tax, earnings increase in London and the South East?
That's a good point. I'm not sure that we've got the data yet to know exactly what is happening for sure, but I think we can. I mean, certainly, it won't be the case that incomes are increasing equally across the entire distribution. I think we can be fairly certain about that. The trend in recent years has been that higher wage jobs have been associated with larger increases in hourly pay and larger increases in the average hours worked, whereas low-paying jobs have tended to be associated with a decline in average weekly hours worked. So I'm sure that the recovery, to the extent that it started, is not evenly distributed across the entire distribution. I think we can be fairly certain about that. In terms of household debt, I think that's a very good point. In fact, there's some evidence that inequality contributed to the recession because disproportionate income gains at the top of the distribution were invested in financial markets, which increased the supply of credit to low-income households who became indebted, and that was sort of at the root of this whole thing. So I think the evidence on household debt is that that's still a major problem. There are still too many households facing too high levels of debt. We haven't certainly got over that problem yet.
For Dr. McCormick, if I may, your referendum briefing, Child Poverty in Scotland, Jim states that changes to benefits from 2012 are likely to have increased it further. Given the cap on welfare spending, what do you think will be the long-term implications on child poverty of not just the cap, but potentially sustained cuts to welfare coming from Westminster? That assumes, of course, there's a no vote.
So we've just looked also at the trend in the decade up to the recession in Scotland, and why did child poverty fall faster in Scotland than the GB average? And so that tells you what happens when things are going in the right direction, and it's to do with not least lone parents moving into work at a higher rate. It's to do with higher take-up of some in-work benefits. It's to do with, on average, higher hours worked across the household. So there were some, if you like, structural advantages built into the Scottish workforce and our demography that meant we did a bit better during the good years. Now, looking ahead to the end of this decade, the single biggest reason why child poverty is projected to rise is something David referred to, which is the decision to uprate benefits and tax credits below the rate of inflation, which sounds like a kind of technical wheeze that chancellors pull out of the bag on budget day and aren't very significant, but actually that's the most significant decision of all. In other words, people on the lowest incomes will increasingly fall below the waterline relative to inflation, which, and it's a good thing, inflation has come down. Nonetheless, that gap remains. So all things being equal, the knowns that are there in the system at the moment lead us to believe that child poverty will rise substantially to the end of this decade, unless there were significant changes either in social security policy or in the labour market prospect. And related to that, we would have to see people who are currently out of work moving back into work at a faster rate, the returns to low-paid staff rising faster than we've seen in the past, and so on. So this is not inevitable. We've seen poverty rates come down as well as go up, but the pathway we're currently on suggests a substantial rise to the end of the decade.
And that could be compounded, presumably, once this notional economic recovery starts to absorb some of the QE money that's been flowing around the economy, which will generate increased inflation. So it could be even worse than we think.
It could be worse than we think, and it could be better on the flip side if other things changed. But one point I would make regarding the kind of London, the South East kind of sucking in effect, I mean, that's true, but it's important to balance that with the point that in every part of the UK, differences within those nations and regions are bigger than between them. So within Scotland, Aberdeen is a full employment city. Yes, there are people who are long-term unemployed, but quite a small number compared to other parts of Scotland. If you're unskilled in Aberdeen, you're far more likely to get into work than is true in Glasgow or Dundee, before we even talk about rural-urban differences. So differences within Scotland are quite an important part of this equation, and working out what we do now or with more powers to close those kind of gaps, for example, in labour market participation rates within Scotland, are also quite important, I think.
Okay, John McCullough.
Yes, my question's for David Iser. You say in your written submission that Scotland has higher income inequality than the Nordic countries, but you also go on to say that tax and benefit changes can only go so far to address that. What are these Nordic countries doing differently, and what can we do differently here in Scotland to get to the same level of equality as we see in these countries?
I do think there's partly a historical, structural explanation in that the Nordic countries didn't have such large manufacturing industrial sectors as we did, so they aren't dealing with quite the legacy of the decline in those sectors that we have. I mean, you can debate what role government policy played in that, but there is a sort of historical factor there. Other differences in terms of the Nordic countries, as I think some of your previous panel members have talked about, there are higher rates of trade union membership, collective bargaining. There's a slightly different culture almost in terms of the interaction between employer organisations, employee organisations, and so on. So there are a range of factors, some historic, some cultural, some structural, that explain differences in the pre-tax and benefit inequality in the Nordic countries compared to the UK. But tax and benefit policy is important as well. I mean, I wouldn't want to give the impression that we were saying that tax and benefit policy isn't important. I think the point that we were making was pre-tax and benefit inequality is high in the UK compared to the Nordic countries, so you can't just think that we can change taxes and benefits and have Nordic levels of inequality. But that's not to say that taxes and benefits aren't important.
But every single area of power that you've outlined, tax and benefits plus employment law, industrial policy, is reserved, industrial relations policy is something that is currently with Westminster.
It's true that most of the sort of immediate levers, if you like, are reserved. But I think going back to some of the things we've said, the long-term drivers of inequality are the interaction between technological change and how that influences demand for skills. So education policy and health policy, given that there are very strong linkages between health inequalities, income inequalities, education inequalities in all directions, those are key levers for addressing inequality in the long term. So I think you're right, short-term levers are very much about tax and benefits and labour market interventions, and most of those are reserved, but there are things that can be done under the current devolved settlement.
In terms of what can be done, Dr McCormick said earlier about the gap in attainment in education. You'll obviously be very aware that that gap in attainment is often quite entrenched by the time a child gets to school. Would that not therefore suggest that a really transformative approach to early years education is what's needed? It's probably the single most significant thing that you could do to close the attainment gap.
I would agree with that, and I would also observe that we're quite fluent in talking about affordability and flexibility of preschool education, but maybe less focused on quality. And if we're talking about disadvantaged children, then it's only high quality childcare that makes a big difference to longer term prospects up to and beyond secondary school if we get it right. So we do have evidence that transformative preschool education has long-term benefits in closing these kind of gaps. There's a grain of truth in both sides of the referendum debate. So let me try and get this right. So the yes side tends to say we can't transform without the powers, and crucially the links back into tax revenues, which we get from improving labour supply, mainly about more mothers going into work. And the no side tends to say, well, we could do more now. What's stopping us? And for me, what's important that if there were to be a no vote and we're into further devolution, then there would need to be substantial devolution of tax credit powers so that you've got the revenue side to allow you to make up for some of the income tax side that you don't have. So there's a really important element of fiscal devolution that would have to go alongside transforming childcare if we were in a post-referendum world where there had been a no vote. If there's a yes vote, I think the fact that transforming childcare has been, probably the number one social policy issue of the year so far, has to bode well for the kind of political space we might find ourselves in. But going back to points made earlier, these things only happen if there's a strong political will, if there's a long-term focus on the next generation, and if there's a genuine degree of political consensus that we want to put these things top of the agenda, partly for economic reasons, but partly for child development reasons and reducing the long-term risk of disadvantage.
Yeah, I think the arguments for taking a very different approach to childcare are in the long-term economic interests of the country, not just the individuals and families, their employment prospects and the prosperity of the children, but actually from the point of view of public services in the longer term. I agree with Jim. Good quality childcare has the potential to make what Ailsa Mackay argued was that Norway was a good model to learn from in that respect, where most provision is public. There are fees for people to pay if their income is above a certain level, but their enrolment of children over 3 is on a full-time basis. The point she made, though, in their briefing on childcare, though, is also that you can't assume that everything's okay once children are at school. We expect people to work a whole range of hours, not just 9 to 5, or certainly not just school hours, but out of school care is really not there in the quality or the level that people actually need, and it's been a significant area of losses as public sector cuts have taken place. So you know, 5-year-olds whose mum works in the care sector and maybe works shifts maybe need some out-of-school care as well. So we need to not just focus on increasing the early years education. You actually need to look at that sort of wraparound childcare that people need if they're going to fully participate. Again, it's not always easy, but out-of-school care is quite crucial, because there are stages where children are only in school for about 4 or 5 hours. You know, there still needs to be childcare that people can access if they're not just going to do sort of mini jobs. And mini jobs aren't good enough. We don't pay good enough wages to lift people out of poverty.
Thank you. We've got 3 members still to ask questions, and we're a little bit short of time, so that we can sharpen up a little bit on questions and answers. That would be very helpful. Richard Baker.
One question for David Isa, who you've referred to the Nordic comparisons with our own economy when it comes to inequality, and there's no doubt we're behind the Nordic countries, and which are often used in this debate on the referendum. But it's also the case, according to figures from OECD, that in those countries, in Norway, Denmark, Finland and Sweden, particularly in Finland and Sweden, inequality is rising at a much faster rate than even it is in the UK. I wondered if you knew why that was the case. Is it because they've moved away from some of the policies you were talking about earlier on? And what lessons are there for Scotland in this, in whatever the constitutional settlement is after September?
You're right, the Nordic countries, inequality in the Nordic countries increased more rapidly than it did in the UK, certainly between mid-90s and mid-2000s. I wouldn't say that that inequality in those countries increased much more rapidly than it did here.
Well, I've got figures from OECD which show in Finland and Sweden it did, not in Norway and Denmark, to be fair, but certainly in those 2 countries.
Okay. And since about 2005-06, I'm not sure that gap has continued to close. But certainly you're right, the gap did close a bit between, certainly over a 10-year period, and it is partly, well, it's for a couple of reasons. Partly, yes, those countries did begin to undertake some of the labour market reforms, if you like, that in terms of labour market flexibility that had been implemented in the UK already. There was another explanation I was going to give. I'm afraid it's just.
That's helpful in itself.
Yes, Dr. McCormack.
Really briefly, it's a kind of current observation, which is if you tuned into the current election campaign in Sweden, where they go to the polls in September as well, you would find quite a bit of concern about how the school system is performing, which some think is related to fragmentation in the school system. Others don't take that view. But you would also find, I think, consistently in the Nordic countries, a genuine concern about a kind of insider-outsider tension that has grown up, whereby often really well-qualified migrants, some refugees, some asylum seekers, struggle greatly to break into secure positions in the core labour market in those countries. And that creates various consequences, but one of which is starting to be felt, I think, in terms of productivity, social cohesion, and it's you know, I wouldn't exaggerate the point, but there are concerns about the kind of shadow effect in the Nordic model, where although they've been open to new citizens, they've been much less successful to varying degrees at integration, inclusion and progression than we might have expected.
Thank you. Marco Bianchi.
You know, we've touched on childcare, but there are all kinds of impacts on women from economic changes. I suppose it would be a fairly simple question if I simply asked, are women considered enough in economic decision making? So instead, perhaps I would make it a little bit more specific and say, in recent years, especially in the context of welfare reform, has the gender differential increased in terms of the impact? And perhaps Maura Gillespie might be the best person, since she's nodding so enthusiastically at my question.
I suppose I think what's still the case is that the different situation of women and men is not sufficiently taken into account when policy decisions are being made. There is still behind all of this an assumption that we're all rational economic agents who will behave in a particular way, and the world just isn't like that, but it makes modelling a lot more difficult unless you assume that. So let's carry on with the models and treating, as I said, things like childcare as leisure, whereas construction is investment in infrastructure. Childcare is investment in human capital at all sorts of levels, as we've already discussed, but it's not treated like that in GDP. And I think one of the reasons we struggle to find a different way of measuring our nation's progress is that these things still stick for people really quite hard, and taking that broader view that incorporates the different roles that women tend to play more than men, but not exclusively. You know, for example, about women account for about 60% of carers, which is more than their population, but it's not all women and no men who care, but it's more likely to affect women. So my general answer is that we're not getting that right. And it's quite interesting that the Scottish Government has quite a good statement each year about its progress and equalities when it's looking at the budget. But do we know we've seen some general data about, for example, who's been affected by the bedroom tax and things like that. But have we got a gender analysis? Because I know that all of the original equality impact analysis said women were much more likely to be affected by that than men, and also disabled people. And the reason women are much more likely to be affected is that particularly lone parents, but women will stay in social housing longer and throughout their lives, and when their kids leave home, they're empty nesters. So there's a perfectly sensible reason why the more women would be affected than men. But have we measured it? Do we know whether women are affected more than men, as we thought? No, we don't, because I don't think the data has been gathered in that way. And I don't think we're good enough at really understanding and taking seriously those differences. Because even though everyone is affected by the same amount of money, whether it's £10 or £11 for a one-bedroom house, if there are 3 times as many women affected as men, then that is a gender inequality that we are creating by not paying attention to anything other than the overall figures or the averages that we talked about earlier. It's different for men and women.
I just ask you something just to better understand the data. You highlight the issue about poverty or inequality being related to fewer hours of work and lower, as well as lower pay. I take it then that any strategy which addressed that, because women are disproportionately the part-time workers, would have a disproportionately positive effect on women. Is that broadly a correct understanding of the data?
Yeah, I think you're broadly right. I mean, so in terms of in-work poverty, low hourly wage is important, and low weekly hours worked is important. Interestingly, one of the changes in the last 10 or 15 years is that there's been a big increase in part-time working among men. I mean, it was always very prevalent among women, but it's been among men that we've seen a big increase in part-time and very flexible hours as well. So I mean, I think broadly you're right, but it's not just to think of the part-time or low hours issue as being a women-only issue is definitely false. And I mean, just to reiterate some of the earlier comments and your question, there are issues around current benefit reform and how they disadvantage women. The rollout of universal credit does appear to be disadvantaging women for at least two reasons that I can think of. One is the way that maintenance payments are counted as means-tested income, and one is the way that there is no earnings disregard for second earners in the household, which again tends to disadvantage women. So there are ways within current policy that women are being disadvantaged that, in theory, could be looked at and addressed relatively easily. I mean, it's a political decision that universal credit's been structured in that way. And the low hours issue, part-time hours issue, is probably more a female issue, but to think of it only as being a female issue would be wrong.
Sorry, can I just one small thing? Another retrogressive thing about universal credit is, after years of understanding why it's important that women get the money in families with children, is to make the payments of universal credit to one person who will invariably who isn't necessarily going to be the person who cares for the children, who's usually the woman. That one step, and that won't make a jot of difference to any figures about poverty or inequality. That'll just happen within the House.
Okay, last time, Michael.
Thank you, Convener, and you'll be pleased to know I'm going to be very brief. Two brief questions, and I'm going to ask for one-word answers. And I'd ask you, in the interest of clarity, to strictly adhere to that. Would you rather see us spend and continue to spend £500 million a year on Trident, or would you rather see that money spent on creating a high-quality, comprehensive childcare system in Scotland?
I take it the one word you're looking for is Trident or childcare.
Sorry, I wasn't asking you the question. It's either yes or no. Would you rather see £500 million a year continue to be spent in Scotland maintaining and replacing Trident, or would you rather see that £500 million spent on creating a high-quality, comprehensive system of childcare? Yes or no?
That's not your proposal, by the way.
Right, okay, can we please not have a discussion between members of the committee?
I don't think those kind of trade-offs are particularly helpful. For what it's worth, I would prefer the childcare, but you know, we could have any number of these trade-offs, and it would be
that's great. Yeah.
I would prioritise childcare over a lot of things. The specific is not relevant for me. I could add quite a long list of things that I think I would put well below childcare.
You know, with the proviso it's a personal view, I would of course opt for childcare, and I would say that we could find a much bigger sum of money across the totality of our budgets, either current or further devolved or independent, by stopping subsidising market failure, which is what we're doing across the board.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
That's your one question.
Yep.
No. Right. Thank you very much. With immaculate timing, that brings us to the end of the session. Thank you very much. All of you coming along, very interesting to the committee to get your views. Appreciate it, and we'll now have a very short suspension to allow a changeover. Thank you. A complete change of topic from looking at inequality and poverty issues in the context of Scotland's economic future. We moved on to looking at Bannockburn Live. This is an issue the committee has taken an interest in the past. We produced a report on this in May of last year, and we heard from Malcolm Ruffhead, who's Chief Executive of Visit Scotland, on this and related issues at the beginning of the year. So I'd like to welcome our panel of witnesses who've kindly joined us this morning, and if I can just find my bit of paper with their names, which I've now done. I'll just start on the left. We've got from Stirling Council, Councillor Neil Benny, who's Deputy Leader of the Council, and Kevin Robertson, Head of Economy, Planning and Regulation. We have Pete Irvin, who is from Unique Events, Managing Director, Dr Mike Cantley, who's Chairman of Visit Scotland, Carolyn Packman, who's the Homecoming Director of Event Scotland, and Peter Solomon, Director of Strategic Development, National Trust for Scotland. Welcome to you all. I'd also like to welcome Bruce Crawford, who's the Constituency MSP for Stirling, who's joining us for this session. Welcome. Now, we have about an hour or so for this session, so we're a little bit short on time, so I'll just remind members, if they could, to keep their questions fairly short and to the point, and I would ask witnesses if they could be as short and to the point as they can in responding to the questions. Clearly, we have quite a disparate panel with different interests, so many of the questions will be directed to particular panel members and may not be relevant to other panel members. But if you want to come in and respond to a question or even a point made by another panel member, if you just catch my eye, I will bring you in as best I can as time allows and allow you to get your views on the record. I wonder if I could then maybe just start off, Dr Cantley, by inviting you, maybe if you could outline, maybe just in a couple of minutes, where we are with the Bannockburn Live event. It's now, I think, what, 9 weeks away, so it's coming up very quickly in terms of planning, in terms of where we are with ticket sales, what the structure of the event is looking like. If I could just invite you, just maybe for 2 minutes or so, just to give us an overview.
Okay. Thank you. I was just looking at the last letter I sent you, where I highlighted 630 events in the Homecoming programme. There are now 827 events in the Homecoming programme. And I think we're about to stop counting, so there we are. That's almost double the last Homecoming programme, so quite something, and 95 signature events in there, of which 2 in particular are pertinent to today as we sit as Team Stirling. I usually represent Team Scotland, but we're Team Stirling today. And of course, Pipefest and Bannockburn Live are 2 of those signature events, and also we'll be talking about Armed Forces Day as well. So there's 233 events that we've already enjoyed this year so far, and Homecoming is going very well so far. Celtic Connections had the most successful year ever, with 110,000 people attending. The Glasgow Film Festival also, with 41,000 attending. Electric Glen was sold out with 24,000 attending, etc., etc. But what we're getting into now are the really key events, some of the really special events. You'll have noticed the John Muir Festival kicking off this week, and the launch of the John Muir Way, and the spectacular home event last week with the Kelpies, which I hope some of you were at, because it was absolutely spectacular. And of course, with the likes of the Kelpies and also obviously Bannockburn Live, the really important thing for us is these are events which then drive on into a real legacy, thanks to the centres that are there. And of course, we've got National Trust with us, who will be driving forward the very successful Bannockburn Centre. So there's 594 events to go, and we're looking forward to them all. The one in particular that we are now leading is Bannockburn Live, which was launched on the 19th of March, which was ironic because it was the date that you were keen to see us to talk about Bannockburn Live, and we were actually launching it on that day. So I maybe pass over very briefly, because you want us to be brief, to Caroline, who will give you the running issues and elements to Bannockburn Live, and maybe just very quickly to Pete to give you the gist of the entertainment programme that we launched on that day. Carol.
Thank you. Well, as Dr. Cantley has just said, the Bannockburn Live programme launched on the 19th of March. Fantastic lineup of music artists, really as strong as any folk music festival in the UK this summer at a fraction of the price. And that, of course, is in addition to the spectacular battle performances. We've got reenactors converging from all over Europe to be part of that. Also a very strong programme of storytellers, genealogy, etc. Food and Drink Village, curated by Scotland Food and Drink. And just yesterday we launched the children's programme as well, because of course in addition to history enthusiasts and music fans, we're also very much targeting the family market with Bannockburn Live. We've had very strong interest in ticket sales so far. We've now sold almost 3,800, which we're very pleased with. It's already a quarter of our target. We've had strong international interest. 33% of ticket sales so far have been to overseas visitors. 18% of the total ticket sales have been to the US market. The King's tickets, the premium price King's tickets, are fully sold out. The Clan pitches are sold out. And we're delighted to announce as well today that First Scotch Ale have come on board as title sponsor for the event, which is great news. We're also working in partnership with First Bus, so in addition to putting on shuttle buses to the event, they'll be working with us on marketing and creative PR opportunities in the run-up to the event. So really at this point the event is in excellent shape. We've already been promoting it extensively through both Visit Scotland and our partner organisation networks, as well as radio and press advertising. The biggest marketing push will come next month with outdoor advertising focusing on train stations and buses. And really we have every confidence that Bannockburn Live will be a huge success.
We're called Unique Events, and that's what we do. A long time ago we did the opening of the Scottish Parliament. And we were very keen to get involved with this. At the time, of course, it was with the National Trust, because I saw this as a real opportunity to do something that had never been done before in the UK. There are battle reenactments, of course, Battle of Hastings, etc., is the big one in England. This event, in a way, has been 700 years in the diary. And so we were very keen to expand it from what people thought it might be, a battle reenactment. It wasn't until that date in March at Stirling Castle that we were able to convey what it was. What it is a festival of history. It's our history, Scottish history if you like, but it's history in general. And as we probably know, there's a great deal of interest in history on television, etc. BBC are going to be doing a big programme about Bannockburn itself. There are endless programmes about Scottish history and other histories at the moment. So I saw this as an opportunity to create an open-air festival, not a music festival, not just a battle reenactment, but everything put together. So as well as the items that Caroline has mentioned, and we have a really strong music programme, quite comparable with any of, as Caroline says, folk music festivals throughout the UK. It's not just traditional, of course, it's contemporary. It's like Celtic Connections in the open air, if you like. And that is deliberately there to sort of convince and convey to people that this is not just a battle thing. It isn't a battle reenactment either. It's a battle show with over 300 people from all over Europe, England, Scotland, and all over Europe taking part in it. They're going to live the part. They're going to be in character all day in medieval encampments around the battle arena. There are 3 shows a day at 12, 2 and 4. And there's another stage called Storyville, which is Scotland's story in words, if you like, but it also includes music. Some of Scotland's top singer-songwriters are involved in that, like Rachel Sermani and Roddy Womble. And we have food talks, book talks. There are 3 books coming out about Bannockburn. They will all be discussed in the wider context of Scottish history. There are food talks within a giant teepee situation with people like Mary Contini and Sue Lawrence. And we're even having a debate each day, a sort of forum where we're going to talk about history in a populist way with academics and media people on that Storyville stage. So there's lots going on all at once. We have to do that because the arena itself only can accommodate about 3,000 or 4,000 people at a time to see the battle. It's quite complex, that crowd management thing of getting people into the arena and out. So all these other stages and activities, including the clan village, the genealogy, including loads of pipe bands that we haven't told anyone about yet. There's loads going on throughout that programme. It's a day out, and for 20 quid, it's actually about the best deal in Britain for a summer festival.
Thank you very much. That's a very good sales pitch, Mr. Irvine. Sounds like a great event, and I'm sure the committee wants to see it being a great success. In fact, I hope we can come along and join you over the weekend. Can I just ask a couple of follow-up questions before I bring in other members? Just on the question of ticket sales, Caroline, you mentioned that I think you said 3,800 have been sold to date. I think the target is 20,000. Is that right?
Target. The capacity is 20,000.
Right. Okay, that's fine. Okay, I mean originally I think it was 45,000 over 3 days, but it's been scaled back quite a lot from that,
that was the original
proposal.
Capacity.
Yeah. You said I'm quite interested in this issue of overseas visitors because, as you remember, the committee did a report in May, and one of the issues we looked at was the year of homecoming, 2009, and how one of the great successes of that was the number of North American visitors who'd come over to support the gathering event that took place in Edinburgh and a number of other events throughout the year. Now, I think you said to me that 18% of sales so far have been to the US market.
To the US market, that's
so
correct.
That'll be roughly 700, would it be?
If that's the maths, then that would be correct.
Well, I mean, I by very pathetic mental arithmetic, it would be something around that figure. I mean, is 700 US visitors coming to this event? Is that, do you think,
that's
satisfactory? I mean, it doesn't sound to me a very large number. I mean, or are you confident that there'll be more coming to other homecoming events throughout the year?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, that's ticket sales so far for Bannockburn, and the Bannockburn, the target market for Bannockburn, yes, it's to attract overseas tourists, but it's also very much aimed at the Scottish market and the rest of the UK market as well. So it's not just an ancestral diaspora-related event at all. So it's very different from the gathering in that respect. Also, as we've mentioned already, Bannockburn Live is just but one event of the full homecoming programme. We'll be conducting an extensive international marketing campaign in all their key markets. So, yes, I mean, of course, there will be many more Americans coming for homecoming events than just for Bannockburn. But we're very pleased. I mean, it's 33% in total from overseas markets, which is great. And of the King's tickets, 35% of those have been sold to the US, 12% to Canada, 7% to Australia. So clearly the event is appealing to the diaspora market, but its appeal is much wider than that.
I think also it would be remiss not to highlight Pipe Fest, because Pipe Fest actually is a fantastic event in its own right on the Friday night. I think the number at the moment, Stirling guys were reminding me, 1,700 pipers piping down from Stirling Castle on the Friday night, and there's a substantial number of visitors. I think there's something like 400 Americans attending that particular event. And it's how all the events dovetail in, because Piping Hot is the European Piping Championships on the 28th of June in Forres. The whole point of homecoming is how all the events integrate together, and certainly it's a huge weekend for Stirling, but there are actually quite a significant number of events on across Scotland actually that weekend.
And if I may add to that, I think we would anticipate that a lot of people will come in the last few days of this. This event has never been done before, obviously, so there is perhaps a lower expectation of it than an event that's been going on for decades, like the Highland Show or something sort of comparable around about that time. And a lot of that's not just visitors or people who live in the area, of course. That's visitors to Scotland who will be around then, see that this is on, see the combination of all the things in Stirling, and decide to come. And if I may further add, the 45,000 people that's been referred to, and that it's been sort of truncated to a capacity of 20,000. It's obvious, I'm sure, why that had to be done. Given that another event landed on this small town in the same weekend, we had to reconfigure it completely. Perhaps we'll talk later about the mechanics of that. But clearly something had to be done, and that's what we did. And that was the sensible thing to do, to have a more realistic target, considering there is a free event in the same town, small town in Scotland, in exactly the same weekend.
I could just ask one more question, if I can, about the event finances. I don't think we've seen a final business plan, but I think you shared with us the projected business plan as at the 28th of January, which had a total expenditure at that stage proposed of 654,000. Is that still the correct total?
Yeah, so how this works is the 650 is the total, which basically comes down in terms of the potential cost every time we sell a ticket. So if you look at it in perspective, I think we're down now from 650 to 515 as the expected cost, thanks to the ticket sales, sponsorship, etc. to date.
Going on these figures you provided, Dr. Cantley, out of the 654,000 cost, 392,000 are coming in various public sector grants. Is that right? So that's about 60% of the total.
Yeah, yeah. There is actually the irony that if we were to keep going at this rate, I mean, if you take it in comparative terms, in terms of where we are, we're about 25% of our expected budget. If you take the Kelpies last weekend, which was a fabulous event, 9,000 people, well, they understand they sold about 15% of their tickets about 3.5 weeks out. You know, the ticket sales came at the very last minute in a similar way to what we anticipate happening here. So we're actually well ahead at the moment, and there is a chance that effectively we might make a profit out of this event, which we will hopefully be able to see as we get closer to it. If that was to happen, we could plough that back in to enhance the event further. So financially, the event's in good shape.
That's a distinct possibility, to actually make a profit, because the target is just 75% of this. We're not quite sure what happens to that profit, but anyway, there's a real possibility. And I'd say that the figure that you talk about, which is under 400k, is very comparable with lots of public subsidies that go to arts events or any.
That's really the question I wanted to ask. I mean, is that 60% of the cost coming from the public sector? Is that comparable with other similar events?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, there's. A comparable figure goes to send an artist to the Venice Biennale. We may not be aware of that, but that's what happens, you know, arts event. This is a cultural event. So that sort of subsidy, which may go on to make a profit. And the $500,000 that it's come down to, I think, is an odd way of look. We always look at an event which has public subsidy and ticket sales and sponsorship, those are, and concessions. Those are the elements. All of those elements are on target.
Bring in Dennis Robertson. Sorry, have you got a follow-up on this question?
Yeah, just specific to the point the convener was trying to make. Is any assessment being made of the economic input, the value of money spent as a result of the event taking place in Stirling?
Bannockburn Live will be evaluated as part of the overall economic input evaluation of Homecoming. So there will be primary research conducted at the event among visitors so that we can establish where they came from, how long they were staying in Scotland, how important was Bannockburn Live as a motivator in their visit to Scotland. Do you have any estimated figures, though, for Bannockburn Live? Projected figures? According to our internal evaluation, it's in the region of around 750,000, but that will be confirmed after the event, because the research that we're doing specifically there will be much more detailed than just the standard model that we apply to our event assessments.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
And Dennis Robertson, Mark Biagi's got a follow-up on this.
On the question of the grants and the cost, we've got a comparable event happening practically in the next field. What's the cost for Armed Forces Day for comparison? Because I had heard a figure of 250,000 from the council. I take it there'll be more than that. There'll be some money coming from the MOD and so on. So,
yes, in terms of the Armed Forces Day national event, the total cost of staging the event is about £524,000, just over £500,000. The council will subsidise that up to £250,000, and there will be other funding from sponsors, from event sales, that's car parking sales and souvenir programme sales, and of course from event catering concessions. So we are also on target in terms of that as well. In terms of the economic evaluation of this, again, Armed Forces Day will be evaluated in terms of economic benefit to Stirling, and we expect that to be in excess of £1 million. And also we expect the publicity that will be attracted through the Armed Forces Day national event in Stirling to also be of that magnitude in terms of value.
Sorry, how much? It was £250,000 from the council, yes. And what was it from the MOD?
Yeah, the MOD subsidising it to 25,000. That's what they always put forward for these Armed Forces Day national events.
And any other public grants?
No, it's mainly from sponsorship and, as I said, from event sales and concessions.
Thanks.
Okay. The other members want to come in with supplementary. So seeing as we're discussing the finances, we might as well stick there for the time being. I'll bring in Alison Johnson, and then I'll bring in Bruce Crawford, and then Chick Booth.
Thank you. I do think this is the most appropriate place to ask this question. And Peter, when you suggested that it was sensible that the capacity and so on had been scaled down given the proximity of a free event from 45,000 to 15, even though there's the potential for 20,000 capacity. You've said it's sensible, but do you not think it's slightly unfortunate that this clash has occurred?
Well, yes. When we found out, I mean, if I was just a commercial promoter involved in putting on a festival in Edinburgh, anywhere, and another festival arrived and decided, for whatever reason, they'd be on at the same weekend, and it was free, I'd have to do something, wouldn't I? I'd have to cancel. I'd have to try and move the weekend, except it has been in the diary a very long time, not just the National Trust diary. Or I would have to redo the figures, and that's what happens all the time with festivals. You redo the figures. In fact, you redo the figures if you're not selling enough tickets or whatever. But that's what happens. The public don't know because it's a commercial thing. They don't have to go through this forensic examination of what you're actually up to. But yes, it was a concern. How do we maintain not just the event, but the integrity of the event? And given at that point we hadn't completely worked out what the programme would be, I had a sense that there was a real potential to make a great programme. And I'm very pleased to say that we've managed to reconstruct those figures on a much lower capacity. And although it's based on 15,000, the Bannockburn, the National Trust event was not budgeted on 45,000, of course. It was budgeted also on 75%, which is about 32,000 tickets. So that was our target then. So we reduced it, certainly, by about half, because people were concerned, particularly the National Trust, they're a charity, that a free event on the same town might attract a lot of local people, and then they might not come to Bannockburn Live. So all I was concerned was to make sure the programme was really good and people would want to come and it was worth the money, and that's what we have done.
Thank you. That's very helpful, and I completely understand why you've taken those steps. Can I just ask, did the MOD come to the council and ask if you would like this event? Did the council write to the MOD and suggest that this year you would like to be the national focus for Armed Forces Day? And when you did so, were you unaware that Bannockburn Live was happening next door?
The process for the application for the Armed Forces Day national event is actually subject to an audit, which will happen after the event. We're kind of, occupied trying to make the event as successful as possible, and there will be an audit, the results of which will be made public in the future. When I first heard about the Armed Forces Day national event, it wasn't clear that there was a clash of dates because the dates weren't necessarily set. However, the MOD did come in and set the date. This is an external agency which came in and set the date, and we didn't have a choice in that.
And was this decision taken by full council? Was it taken by one individual? Is there a record of where and how this decision was agreed by Stirling Council?
I believe that information has already been made available to committee. It went to a civic committee of the council. That was when it was first discussed.
And that's a committee that you would usually sort of decide upon, small grants to community organisations. But that committee had the power to make this decision on behalf of the whole council.
No, the committee will look at all events in the civic calendar. Okay. So it would be anything civic, anything that was considered civic.
But you're saying that Stirling Council were unaware that Bannockburn Live was happening?
No, that's not what I'm saying.
You just said that Stirling Council, you weren't sure about the date that the MOD...
I personally wasn't sure about the date that the MOD was going to be setting the national...
I'm somewhat staggered at the lack of coordination or discussion. Perhaps Dr Cantley could help here. I assume that Visit Scotland must have a calendar that's published, and you probably will be liaising with local authorities all the time on issues like this. Are you surprised that we find ourselves in the position that we do?
Well, it would have been. I think we would have liked to have been at least known that the event was coming a little earlier if there was the possibility. But I think it's very important to see we're in the events business and we take every opportunity that we get. And we're delighted to be working with Stirling Council, and we're absolutely determined that we will make the most of this weekend and the opportunity of running the 3 events. I suppose you could look at it both ways. And if Armed Forces Day had been on a separate weekend, then there would have potentially been 2 opportunities for the local trade. But I think it's fair to say having the 3 events together will create such an amazing spectacle that we will certainly be working with Stirling Council to ensure that it is the opportunity to position Stirling on the world stage, and we will work very hard to ensure that.
Okay, thank you. Can I just ask Councillor Benny one further question? I believe the Audit Committee of Stirling Council are having an inquiry at the moment into how this decision was made. Do you know when that inquiry will finish and when its results will be published?
Yes, this is the inquiry. This is the external audit that I was speaking about. Effectively, the Audit Committee, which I sit on, asked the Chief Executive to commission a piece of work to look at the process leading up to the decision making for the National Armed Forces Day, and that is being done by external auditors, and it will report. I'm not entirely sure exactly when, but it will probably be after the summer.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Mr Crawford.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you for allowing me to ask questions. Another question on transport, if you don't mind.
Well, we'll come back to that later, if that's all right.
Yeah. Well, I've got my King's tickets, first of all, for both myself and my wife, so I'm signed up to this event, and I'm with Dr Cantley. I think this weekend could be a spectacular success, despite the fact that both of them are being held on the same day, and I'm on record of saying that. And I think we'll all agree that it's critical that whatever we do, that the whole thing dovetails as well as it possibly can on that particular weekend. But I am interested to know, though, what economic assessment was done by the Council prior to the decision to make an application for the Armed Forces Day in terms of the potential for the events being on the same day. What economic assessment was carried out prior to the application being made?
The Council wouldn't normally take a full economic assessment before it makes a decision like that. It would not have been the subject of a large-scale look at exactly what the economic impacts would be. I think that the decisions leading up to the leading up to the bid for the National Armed Forces Day really kind of focused on the idea of creating this major event in the Stirling area. I've said myself quite a number of times now that this event is a huge honour for Stirling, but it's also a major opportunity. And just the other week, we had events. We've had an event with local businesses where they were able to come along and find out about all the different things that are going on in the whole of the 2014 calendar, because as well as this weekend, there are other major events in the Stirling area. And this is a huge economic opportunity. When you bring large numbers of people into the town, then you're going to be creating quite a significant opportunity for businesses and for that economic impact to happen. Now, I'm not sure, maybe Kevin can say something about any sort of more economic assessments. But in terms of where I was coming from and where certainly colleagues were coming from, was the idea that by holding a large event like this, you will create opportunities, major economic opportunities.
If I can, I'll be very, very brief. Armed Forces Day National Event forms part of a year-long calendar of events in Stirling, and we have 240 events occurring in the Stirling area during 2014. We started off with the Hogmanay 2013, which is a fabulous success in Stirling, and that actually generated significant economic benefit to the Stirling and indeed the wider Central Scotland area, so that's important. In terms of the weekend itself, it is an absolutely fabulous opportunity for Stirling to showcase itself. We will have a huge number of visitors that actually many may go to Armed Forces Day National Event and also Bannockburn live on the Sunday. So we expect we will get significant economic benefits to the Stirling area. And what we're also doing, we have Pipe Fest on the Friday, Armed Forces National Day national event on the Saturday, Bannockburn Live the Saturday, Sunday, and on the Saturday evening we're having a big night in Stirling where there'll be a lot of activity, pubs, restaurants, hotels, outdoor performances, etc. And we hope a lot of our visitors will stay and avail themselves of the opportunities. So we expect huge economic benefits for Stirling, and there will of course be, as outlined earlier, a full economic assessment of the weekend.
So there was no prior economic assessment done. Was there what financial modelling, of any, was done prior to the application being made?
In terms of the financial assessment, obviously we didn't carry out, as Councillor Benny has said, a full economic appraisal because we knew there would be significant economic benefits to Stirling. In terms of the event itself, once the MOD had announced that Stirling was hosting the event, we were then able to begin to build up what that event would actually cost. We have actually been to Edinburgh, Nottingham and Plymouth, who have hosted the past 3 very successful Armed Forces Day national events, and that's given us a very clear indication as to what the costs will be, and we're working within a cost plan that outlined.
I understand that, but are you confirming then there was no financial modelling carried out prior to the application being made?
No detailed modelling was carried out prior to that.
Thank you.
Could I could I just say that
it was a bit of a surprise when it was announced that Armed Forces Day was going to be in Stirling, and I think the mechanisms of that decision no one was aware of. So I don't think there was any opportunity to think about the economic implications of having them on the same weekend. You know, and the idea that it would all come together for a big Stirling weekend was obviously a subsequent once it was understood, because I don't think anyone knew that it was going to happen, not the police, not anyone, that it would happen. So, but this is a solution to the situation, and it will be the congregation of these events in Stirling that will be make a very significant impact. But it did come sort of out of the blue.
To timelines and decision-making process later, but at the end of the day, somebody made a decision. Who was it? Who made the decision that Armed Forces Day would take place knowing that there was going to be a Bannockburn Live event? Who took the decision?
I think that's what we've said earlier, is that the decision process is a subject of external audit, and I think it would be inappropriate at this stage to talk about that before the audit report is made public. And of course this committee will get the chance to see that report when it comes out in the future.
Can I just say, my business experience, when there's an audit before an event actually happens, suggests that something is wrong with the event, that there are concerns. So what are the concerns?
Can I just say on this, the event has the full support of the council. It's supported on a cross-party basis on the council. There are 1 or 2 dissenters who dissent from having any armed forces events in Stirling, and that's fine. That's their principled stance. But the Armed Forces Day national event has been subject of a number of council's discussions at the full council, and at each opportunity it has been endorsed on a cross-party basis. I think it's fair to say that while the audit is there in terms of all of the intricacies of the individual decision-making processes leading up to the announcement, the fact is that the Council stands 100% squarely behind this event and the huge economic economic, social and legacy issues that we're going to be getting out of this as well. And those are significant opportunities for the Council, and the Council stands behind that.
We all want both events to be successful. I mean, I have some concerns. There's always, when you've got huge events, I haven't seen the detailed planning as part of a business plan either from Bannockburn Live or Air Force Day. So clearly, I hope there are more people than we currently have planned, but that brings challenges with it. I'm still not clear that how a decision could be made like this, and yet Scotland's premier events organisation, according to Mr Irvine, were unaware. They didn't know what the mechanism was. How could that happen?
Well, I think this is the kind of issues that we're trying to get out of the audit. But what we're trying to do at the moment is focus on the fact that this is a huge opportunity for Stirling, and that we're trying to organise what is a huge weekend for Stirling and a tremendous opportunity for Stirling. So really, those are the kind of issues that we do need to look at in terms of the audit and learn from in the future.
Sure, we'll look at it once the audit's prepared. But just one last question, if I may, convener, coming back to finances. There are two events on the same day. My colleague Mike McKenzie asked about the economic output, and Carlin Packman, by the way, who did a great job in the John Muir event that I attended on Monday. How are you going to make sure that your revenues and your expenses individually are ring-fenced? So you know how that one is not going to be more successful at the expense of the other in terms of determining, hopefully, the success of both events. How are you going to ring-fence the expenses, and no doubt we'll come to planning and transport and what have you, and look at the economic benefits and how they're apportioned?
The event does have is managed within the council, so I think it would probably be more appropriate for Kevin to answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the Armed Forces Day national event, we have a very robust cost plan set out, which outlined the headline costs and income earlier. And of course, that will be managed, and the project will be delivered within that cost plan, and that's very, very important in terms of that. In terms of, it's more for, I would suggest, Visit Scotland to talk about the costs related to Bannockburn Live, and I think that's been outlined to you earlier in terms of where their income will come from as well. So I think what's important here is that both events are a huge success. Both events will generate huge economic value, but equally, both events have been very effectively project managed. And if I can just go on to say that we have established a joint liaison steering group and joint working groups looking at transport and infrastructure, marketing and communication, and emergency planning, which links both events in all of these aspects. And it's really been a very effective joint working arrangement, and it's ensured that both events, while maybe not being complementary, are certainly coordinated in a fashion that both will be successful and both will be of huge benefit to Stirling and Scotland. And I'm sure it will be a very, very successful day on all accounts.
Just one last query, and this applies to both.
Yeah, the Bannockburn Live budget is being managed by Unique Events, and it's a very precise budget. We know exactly at the moment where it's all going. There's a contingency as usual, and we will not spend it unless we really have to. And it's a very simple matter. You know, that we know what the income is apart from the ticket sales, and we're working hard all together to ensure that those ticket sales meet their target. All the other targets are met, and all the expenditures are very, very carefully managed by us. Every single item, hundreds of them, are managed by us, and we'll bring it in on budget.
That was my last question. And as I say, I repeat, I hope both events, I'm sure with the will of those involved, will be successful. But there's always a downside risk. What provisions have you made for contract exposure, both organisations?
In terms of
or not fulfilling a contract?
Well, that's completely covered at Bannockburn Live. I mean, we've negotiated with all those who are contracted to Bannockburn Live will go ahead and will be great. It's fairly straightforward. It's a straightforward event. I mean, what we've done, and if you take what we've tried to do, when National Trust asked us to take it on, it was primarily, in fact, it was entirely, I think, because Armed Forces Day was coming and the event had to be configured to best fit. So, for instance, in reducing the capacity from 15,000 a day to 10,000 a day, that's primarily actually because the events we're going to run on the field on that day will take up the space that you couldn't fit more than 10,000 people in with the battle enactment and the campsite, etc. So it's to make best use of the assets. But the contractors at Bannockburn Live are entirely covered. And the event is looking absolutely fine. It's in good shape.
Stirling Council manages its financial and contractual obligations under a robust and audited set of controls. Kevin, do you want to say anything?
I was just going to say about what I would say is that the temporary event infrastructure and services are covered through robust contracts. And of course, a lot of what is happening at Armed Forces Day is provided by the Armed Forces themselves, and we have that certainty that they will be providing what is required.
Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. It would appear from some of the comment and answers we're having so far is there seems to be an element of surprise that certainly Armed Forces Day was going to happen on the same day as Bannockburn, and we seem to be hearing that people are reacting due to that event taking place at the same time. I wonder if I may go to Dr. Cantley, in terms of how far down the road were you in your planning in terms of the infrastructure, the logistics, say, for transport, in terms of bus, rail, park and ride facilities, all that, and did you have to then refocus and then enter into, I think it was suggested, we've got a liaison group now looking at that, but did that make a huge impact in your initial planning?
I think it's important just to highlight again, we only took on the event from National Trust for Scotland in mid-January, which was, of course, was, of course, before. We had 2 months to work through before the actual event launched on the 19th of March. So Pete and Caroline might be better placed to help. But from our perspective, I mean, I think we need to appreciate. I mean, Stirling Council have a huge project on their hands here, Armed Forces Day, and it's potentially, we're talking about 50,000 people. I mean, that is a lot of people. Bannockburn Live is budgeted at about 7,500 on that Saturday. And if you take one of the other, I mean, we're responsible, Visit Scotland, Event Scotland is responsible for delivering Ryder Cup on behalf of government. You know, Ryder Cup will be 45,000 people a day. You know, Armed Forces Day is a very big event, and we're absolutely dedicated. I'm dedicated as Chair of Visit Scotland to helping Stirling Council as best we can to ensure we deliver these 3 events. We've got to look at it as a great opportunity, and we've got to take the opportunity to make sure we seize the chance to position Stirling and Scotland on the world stage.
No, I think it's a fantastic opportunity. I think we'll applaud the fact that it's going to be an absolute showcase for Stirling. I just come back to the fact that we seem to be reacting to something that hadn't been initially planned at the same time. Mr. Selwyn, maybe you could answer the fact and the logistics and how far we are down in terms of the preparedness for transport.
Yes, of course I can. I should say at the outset that the National Trust for Scotland, of course, is still fully involved with the project, as a host, obviously, as a participant in providing some of the activities and the entertainment, extensive marketing support as well, and as a partner in that same liaison group. So we haven't gone away. But our role clearly is not as promoters, and in that respect we're not taking the risk or sharing in the potential upside, I may add, as well. Very briefly, just because I think it's important to have the context of the timeline that led us to where we are now. The National Trust for Scotland had always planned a form of reenactment, albeit a modest one, for June 2014 to coincide with the battle and, of course, the opening of our new visitor centre. We were subsequently approached by Visit Scotland with the homecoming team on the back of questions as to whether or not there would or would not be a clan gathering in Scotland, and a discussion around the table about whether there's an opportunity here for Scotland, for Stirling, to widen the scope of our plans and extend its duration. And the National Trust for Scotland recognised what the opportunity and the potential was here, as is now coming into fruition. And we were well and truly up for it on a big assumption that we would, or a condition rather, that it would be cost neutral for us, because it's not our core business to be speculating in a commercial enterprise. This would have to be a charging ticketed event. So we agreed that this was indeed possible. And subsequently then there was an awful lot of assembly of funding package, of the appointment of an experienced and competent project manager who could put together the events programme, and setting up various joint liaison forums, particularly with Police Scotland and with the local authority and indeed with Transport Scotland, because the logistics was always going to be such a crucial part of the operation. And everything was moving along quite nicely, but we were taken by surprise on the 25th of August when we heard through the media that the Armed Forces Day event was now in town. Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Which immediately made us have to go back to the drawing board and think, what are the impacts here on the business model hitherto put together? We now have a charging event going head-to-head potentially with a free event. The market appeal for both was potentially overlapping, and we could potentially split the market between them. And, of course, logistically, the uncertainty in terms of the plans that were emerging for traffic management, particularly park and ride schemes, shuttle bus and car parking and locations, etc. And there was immediately, and chaired by myself, a meeting of the then joint liaison group involving Stirling Council, involving the various funding partners, including Visit Scotland and the Homecoming team, including unique events, at which there was taking stock of the information that had landed upon us and what we collectively were going to do and what the National Trust position might be thereafter. And the conclusion, I think, was very simple. This was a big opportunity for Stirling, a big weekend. We have to pull together and make damn sure it happens. And that's what the energy and effort has been put into subsequently. But at the same time, fundamentally, the National Trust for Scotland would be unable to continue as the lead agency, as the promoter, as the risk taker, because the financial proposition clearly was more uncertain, and certainly our trustees, when it was put to them, were very clear that this was an unacceptable risk for the charitable enterprise that we are. It's different from our core purpose. And therefore, all the energy and effort was put into the transfer of the undertakings from ourselves to Visit Scotland, which had to be agreed and negotiated, and in the meantime to try and keep the momentum going as best we could. And that has continued to this day, now that we know where the operating responsibility lies, that the event programme is adapting to the circumstances, and as I said at the very outset, the National Trust for Scotland remains as a member of that liaison group, committed to play our part in a number of different respects.
Who's taking the lead in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of transport? We've got a liaison group. Who's taking the lead on that now to ensure that we've got the park and ride, the rail, the bus links, the car parking? Is it Stirling Council taking the lead?
It is Stirling Council. And Stirling's actually very fortunate to be well served by good transport infrastructure, which you've highlighted there in terms of motorway links, in terms of rail services and so forth. What we have established, and it has been running now for the last 7 months, is the joint transport and infrastructure group that has developed a very robust transport plan for this event. Obviously, we realise that in order to make this event a huge success for Stirling and to ensure that the large visitor numbers get to Stirling without any undue delay, that we've put in place a robust plan that involves park and ride, car parking, specific routes to both events, also involves increased rail services in terms of capacity, and that's been agreed with First ScotRail. We're also encouraging groups to arrive by hired coach or minibus, and of course National Express and other bus operators are increasing their services to Stirling on that day. In fact, National Express are giving discounts to services. We have adequate parking for both events. We have shuttle buses that will operate between the city centre and Bannockburn, allowing people to get to and from Bannockburn from the city centre, but also to come to Armed Forces Day should they wish to spend part of their day there as well. So,
involved in
absolutely. We have Transport Scotland, Police Scotland, Bear Scotland, the Council, the events management companies, and all the partners around the table here are all part of that group. The transport plan, in fact, was tested a couple of weeks ago, and some minor adjustments have been made to it, but it is a very robust transport plan that we have in place.
Okay, thank you.
And on our part, we've been working on the transport plan for a year, and the fortuitous aspect of the infrastructure is that there are 2 motorway junctions. So one will be for Bannockburn Live, essentially, and one will be for Armed Forces, for traffic. So as far as we're concerned, we're looking after that. As soon as we believe that motorway and come towards us and come to our area, we have enough provision for parking. We have the bus stops, the park and ride, things worked out. We, of course, have got literally hundreds and hundreds of people who are going to be on site anyway, because we have clans from all over the world. We have thousands of people working on this event, and they have to park too. So we're working in detail as to where they park, where the traders park, and how the public get to and from us throughout those 2 days. It's not just one day, of course, it's a weekend. So we're pretty far advanced in our own transport plan, and it's dovetailing with the wider plan now that Armed Forces Day are with us.
Is there a contingency plan in terms of weather, because obviously I suppose a lot of the parking will be in some of the fields, etc. Is there a contingency plan if the weather is, as Scottish weather can be sometimes, wet on the day, in terms of ensuring that we've got the appropriate fields, etc. for parking, and there's going to be no disruption to it?
Because it's a two-day event, of course, what can happen is that it's very wet on Saturday, and therefore the field is churned up. So we have another field. We have a contingency field, as it were.
Yeah.
But there aren't a number of cars involved, obviously, with Bannockburn Live than there are with Armed Forces
Day. Armed Forces Day.
In terms of Armed Forces Day, if I can just respond to that question as well. The majority of parking is actually on hard standing. We are using existing car parks provided by local businesses and also business parks, and also within the city itself. There is contingency parking there as well. So should we have, unfortunately, some wet weather that might make some of the field parking more difficult, then what we have done at the outset is to actually move a substantial proportion of that parking away from grassed areas.
Okay, now, I know Bruce Crawford's got a follow-up on transport. Do other members want to ask about transport? Well, I'll give priority to the committee member.
That's fine for the parking, but if you're having 50,000 people on a field for an actual event, that's a lot of churn as well. So what's the contingency for the actual Alpha site?
In terms of the site of the Armed Forces Day national event, the event field has been drained, so we will have a surface that will certainly cope with wet weather to a point. What we're also doing is we're ensuring that there's sufficient trackway to allow visitors to move around the field, and should we have to move part of the event from one part of a field to another, we have got that contingency in place. But actually, we fully expect the event field and the layout that we've developed to cope with a certainly typical June Scottish weather.
I did look up the weather stats. It does rain 1/3 of days in Scotland, and even in the middle of June. So this is quite a substantial. I know. I can always see the bright side of life.
Is it more rain ahead of the sunshine policy?
It's quite a substantial risk then. So is there? You know, should it be the case that 50,000 people moving around is rained quite heavily, and this flowing mechanism you've got doesn't work? Is there an alternative site prepared for Armed Forces Day?
It wouldn't be possible with an event of the complexity and scale of Armed Forces Day national event to have a second site, right. No. And what I think I've outlined is that the site that we have will be very well prepared. And, you know, taking your point about, yes, it does rain a lot in Scotland. Yeah. We also have a lot of outdoor events in Scotland which are able to carry on with that type of weather. So we fully expect that what we have put in place and the contingency planning as well will be able to cope with what I would say would be typical June weather, which let's hope isn't raining, but we can expect some, I think.
And on the issue of transport, I've got some experience in my constituency of what happens with transport projects if Transport Scotland isn't involved. Have you consulted Transport Scotland about transport planning, both sets of events here?
Yes.
And if so, have they given their seal of approval to the plans that are being put in place?
Transport Scotland are a key partner and have been involved from the outset in terms of the transport planning, which incidentally has included traffic modelling. As Peter Irvin said there, we're fortunate in Stirling. We have 2 motorway junctions, and Junction 10 is where the majority of traffic will leave for Armed Forces Day. Modelling has been undertaken at both junctions. In fact, Junction 9 going to Bannockburn Live will be no more traffic on a Saturday than one would get on a typical peak coming into Stirling on a weekday morning. So we're very confident that it will be handled there. And similarly, at Junction 10, our modelling has shown that that will work. Transport Scotland, as I said, have been involved from the outset, and we're making 1 or 2 adjustments to suit their requirements, but they're relatively comfortable with how this is moving forward.
So the transport plan isn't finalised yet, but Transport Scotland is a key partner in finishing that?
Absolutely. We hope to sign off the transport plan in the next week or so.
Next week or so?
In the next week or so.
And Bannockburn Transport Scotland involvement?
Transport plan signed off, isn't it?
Yes, Transport Scotland have signed off the Bannockburn Live transport plan already, yes.
Okay, Bruce Crawford.
Marcus covered some of the ground, so I'll cut straight to the chase. On the 11th of April, Joanna Boyd, the council leader, was involved in a bit of correspondence with The Minister, and at that stage, said we expect the plan to receive final sign-off of a meeting of key agencies this week. It's now the 27th. What's the issues that's avoiding sign-off? So, because this is obviously critical to the success of both events.
It's actually been the Easter holidays have actually delayed it, with key officers not necessarily being there. That's the only reason. The minor adjustments that we're talking about are actually where we would put some signage and so forth in terms of the plan. We want to sign this plan off as 100%, and if we need to make any adjustments on the day, we'd be able to do that. But we fully expect that to be signed off in the next week.
Well, it was on the 11th of April. We're saying it was going to be signed off the next week. That's, forgive me, Kevin, that's a wee bit before Easter. I know that maybe Easter gets in the way, but I hope it is only minor things and this can be signed off, because it's obviously crucial to the release of government support to the event.
Yeah, we're well aware of that, and I can assure you that it is just minor detail.
It's not unusual for a transport plan to be absolutely finalised much closer to the event. The main thing that we need is that the public are aware of how they get to and from events, and we need to get that information out to them.
I think we've done transport, so we can move on.
Yes, I'm new to this committee and I'm new to the subject because it's not in my region, and I haven't been on the committee when evidence was taken in the past. But it has been a revelation to me today, and a shock as well. I mean, the revelation is Mr Irvin's outline of the event sounds really exciting, and I'm definitely wanting to go and buy my tickets now. But I'm really shocked at what I've heard about the way Armed Forces Day just seemed to have been, I can only use the word bounced, on the organisers of the existing festival. And can I just ask the question that's probably in the back of everybody's head, but nobody's actually asked it yet? Mr Irvin, do you think this was a political decision to have Armed Forces Day in Stirling at the same time as Bannockburn, and perhaps even motivated by desire to diminish the Bannockburn Festival in some way?
I don't get involved in politics, and I don't like to get involved in commenting on politics. I'm not just ducking the question. You know, what I said earlier is I don't know how these decisions are made. You know that, and you know we did hear about it from the media. That's all. I have no comments to make further about that.
If I can, yeah, can I just say something on that? I think just from my own point of view, both events are actually in my council ward. Although the National Armed Forces Day is most of the event is actually on the other side of the road, but I like to think of both events as happening basically in my backyard. I am really, really keen for the Bannockburn Live event to be as successful as possible. It's a huge opportunity for Stirling, for the people of Stirling, for businesses in Stirling, and it's a great way to commemorate the Battle of Bannockburn, which is actually a major part of our visitor attractiveness in Stirling. I grew up, I went to the Borestone Primary School, which is obviously right next to the visitor centre. I was interestingly, I was on the planning panel that gave the new visitor centre approval. I think it's brilliant, it's a wonderful thing. And the opening event is tremendously important to me that opening event is successful. It's also tremendously important to the council. I think there is no question that there was any attempt to try and diminish the Bannockburn Live event from Stirling Council's part. We're really keen. Because
Mr Irvin's already said that he's had to, you know, revise his business plan to curtail the festival.
If I could maybe say on that, the Armed Forces Day national event is taking place on the Saturday. The curtailment of the event is the Monday. I'm not sure that necessarily the two things are.
Well, Mr Irvin runs the most successful events company in Scotland, and he specifically said at the outset of his evidence that he changed the plan because Armed Forces Day was. He didn't use the word bounced, but clearly was bounced on them.
I don't see the connection myself.
Well, maybe I can help. And because beyond what Pete said, the opportunity when our Event Scotland team got in about it with Pete to look at how we make the most of the most of Bannockburn Live and how it dovetails with Armed Forces Day has led to a number of really important benefits for Bannockburn Live in particular. because, yes, we have folded the Monday into the Saturday and Sunday, but actually that was also because the demand for Saturday and Sunday outstripped Monday massively. There was very, very little demand for Monday. And what it has led to is we've managed to extend the hours of both Saturday and Sunday and extend the programme so that the event is better still on the Saturday and Sunday, and those people who are coming will have a really good day. And it's allowed us to use the Monday for the clans that are very excited by that. So actually we've been able to seize the opportunity and bring that round to the good. And there is no doubt, and I say this as a Stirling person, there is no doubt that across the political divide, it's heads down now across the political divide to make the most of all three events that are coming our way at the end of June. And I intend to be as much a part of that as I possibly can.
Okay. Richard Baker, I think, got something.
Very briefly, on the tackle of political sensitivities, presumably, Dr. Cantley, what you're saying is that the approach of Visit Scotland and others who are involved in both these events has been to support them and make them as successful as possible, beyond the fact that Armed Forces Day is happening at a sensitive time in terms of the political, in terms of the referendum, to be blunt, and also, of course, the decision to expand Bannockburn celebrations too was coming, expanded from the original ideas, was coming at a sensitive time as well. So presumably the approach has been that everyone is getting behind these across the political spectrum, and indeed, from your point of view as well, beyond almost taking out of it the kind of the political sensitivity of time, which affect both events.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. We're focused on making the most of all three events, actually, and indeed the other events of the weekend. I opened an event called Bannockburn Remembered at the Smith last week, and I was interested in the very large number of politicians. There was our provost, our past provost before the past provost, and many others covering the political divide, an ex-presiding officer, and so on. And I made comment that, and I think you said it yourself, Convener, there's an absolute anticipation that the Bannockburn event, Bannockburn Live in particular, will be conducted in a manner which will appropriately celebrate the occasion, and across the political divide there's absolute support for that. And our job at the events end with our Event Scotland team, Visit Scotland, is absolutely to support Stirling Council. I am going to be part of the steering group over this last period of Armed Forces Day to help as well. We will do everything we possibly can to make sure it is a spectacular weekend for Stirling and Scotland.
I think I share my colleagues' astonishment with what we've heard today. I'm particularly concerned, Mr. Selman, you pointed out, there you were organising an event of national significance, a big important event, and you found out through the media that another big event of national importance and significance was going to be happening in a neighbouring field. Now, nobody is going to suggest that that's helpful, or even courteous, or perhaps even, it's just not vaguely sensible. So what I'd like to sort of get down to is how much consultation is going on with traders, with hoteliers, with B&B owners who may have had two bumper weekends, as Dr. Cantley. I understand we are where we are now. We will make the most of this. I'm sure it will be a very positive, successful event. We could have had two incredibly positive, successful weekends shining light on the great city of Stirling, but that's maybe an issue for another day. But what I'd like to be reassured of, perhaps, is that there's more consultation, liaison and dialogue in future, because we have the National Tourism Agency for Scotland, who have been unaware of what one of our largest councils was intending doing. So I'd just like to understand how Visit Scotland's calendar is shared with others, because we wouldn't want this to happen again, might I suggest, or we'd at least like to have a discussion as to whether or not this is what we would want to happen, rather than simply having to accept it and then change our plans.
Well, that's a good point in terms of ensuring the widespread knowledge of the calendar. And we are here to help at any point. And I'm now been having an ongoing discussion with the Provost in particular, and we will offering support. We are offering support in any way we can to help. But I think the point is well made that the sooner we know about events, we're here to help anyone who's organising events in Scotland, and we do that to the best of our ability. And actually, this is a classic year with 800 events. It's an amazing number of events, and yes, dovetailing them is a significant challenge. Actually, it's such a great opportunity to exploit.
Thank you.
Very quickly, having listened to your answer, which was, I think, assuaging the question, the correct question that was asked of Stirling Council, Dr. Cantley. Why have you reduced the numbers and the days? It was purely because it was bounced, wasn't it?
To be fair, reducing from Monday to the weekend was an obvious thing to do. To be exact, 134 people had bought tickets.
Not according to National Trust, it was.
Well, when we got 134 people, so the obvious thing to do was to reduce to turn, and we actually offered those 134 people tickets for the Saturday and Sunday. But you've got to remember, these guys are responding, having brought the project through from August. We've taken the project on from January, and there were a handful of really obvious things to do, which we have done. So that was the key. That was the key feature, and obviously extending the hours, especially to overlap when there was Armed Forces Day as well. But I think the most important thing that I'm hoping to get through with the committee today is a real sign-off for Bannockburn Live. This project, in my professional experience, is in really good shape, and there will be lots of people listening to what you have to say. And I hope you will give them confidence that Bannockburn Live is going to be an excellent event and should be going buying tickets, as I know you will. Our tickets always spike after a committee session, so I'm going to hold that to you. Okay.
Yeah, provided, of course, that it's a positive result from this meeting. And I would just reiterate that whatever it may have been, or whatever people thought it might be, Bannockburn Live is now configured at exactly the right scale, the right sort of nature. It is a completely one-off thing. It will never happen again. It's a very unique event, if I may say, for Scotland. Armed Forces Day is a very different thing. It does happen in other places each year. This Bannockburn Live will never be seen again, and I think that there will be huge public interest in it, actually. And of course, it's not helpful that it's politicised, because this is created as a cultural celebration. That's what it is.
I'm very much looking forward to what I think is going to be a superb event, and indeed I hope both events are good. I just want to return, Convener, to the area of questioning that I was pursuing earlier on about the economic benefit, because Councillor Benny then told me that in answer to that question that your assessment of that benefit is about £1 million. Was that correct? The wider economic benefit?
I think it was Kevin.
Yeah, I mean,
oh, was it?
Yes,
right,
it was.
okay.
And in terms of what we have done is we've looked at similar Armed Forces Day national events that have happened over the past 3 years. I mentioned earlier that we've been to Plymouth, Nottingham and Edinburgh, here where it was held in 2011. And from indications from the evaluation of the success of these events, we're very confident that it will be £1 million plus in terms of economic benefits for the Stirling area through Armed Forces Day national events. And picking up on an earlier point about engagement with the local businesses, there's been a programme now over the past 18 months where we've engaged with the tourism businesses, hoteliers and other supply services businesses on the run-up to 2014. So businesses in the Stirling area have been well aware of the 2014 programme, and in fact over the last 6 weeks we have had sessions in Callander, Dunblane, Bridge of Allen and a very well attended session in Stirling where we had a range of businesses, and they were able to not only hear of what's happening over that particular weekend and other weekends, but we're also able to meet the various agencies that are delivering the projects so that they can avail themselves of every opportunity that this increased visitor numbers will bring, and therefore economic benefit and benefit to them as businesses.
So, but am I correct in saying that you haven't done a proper, sophisticated cost-benefit analysis? You've just looked at what other areas were able to achieve and kind of worked it out somehow or other?
What we do is we undertake a full evaluation of the event once an event has taken place. We don't do detailed evaluation in advance of an event. However, what we have got, for example, examples of the benefits that Hogmanay brings to Stirling, and that's a much smaller event, and we can scale up from that.
So, the suggestion has been made that it may have been better for Stirling, for the people of Stirling, to have had those events on different occasions in terms of maximising the benefit, but you couldn't say whether that would be the case or not.
I think what we need to focus on, and that's what we are doing.
Please answer the question. You're not in a position to say whether that would have been a better option or not.
Not in a position to say whether it would be a better option or not. I think what I can say is that the events of that weekend are going to be a fantastic opportunity and a huge economic benefit for Stirling.
Yeah, okay, but I think we've got that, and I hope indeed you're correct. But I've got one misgiving. A friend of mine in Stirling was saying to me just the other day that, I understand you've explained that you've had to do drainage work to the field where this is going to take place. But a friend of mine was saying just the other day that it's not even been seeded yet, this field. And that gives me a bit of concern. Should I bring my wellies to attend this event? Is it going to be, because, I do know something about these matters. Is this going to be a really muddy field that's impossible? And
the field has been sown, rolled, redrained. And
when did that happen?
That happened in the last couple of weeks. And we fully expect the field will be ready well in advance of the Armed Forces Day national event. That's the advice we've got from those we've consulted. So although it may not look like there's much grass there at the moment, we are assured that we will have a grass covering for this event.
I hope you've got that assurance in writing and there's a good copy with your lawyers, because it does sound, I think any of us that know about the Scottish climate, that does sound a wee bit optimistic that you're going to have a grass that 50,000 people are going to walk on.
We're very confident the field will be ready in advance of the event.
Okay, thank you. I very much hope you're correct.
Very briefly, we heard from Scotland about the sponsorship successes that you've had for Bannockburn Live. I know that there's obviously sponsorship being sought for the Armed Forces Day as well. Can you tell us who to date have committed to sponsorship? Because I think the target was £190,000 sponsorship, and how much that target is, how close you're getting to it.
That's correct. We are concluding our sponsorship agreements, but I wouldn't want to say at this stage who these sponsors are.
But you're confident you'll get to your target?
We are reasonably confident we'll get to the target.
Okay, thank you.
And I'd maybe like to just throw in a positive point in that there is the argument, well, if the events had been on 2 separate days in Stirling, as a city would have had 2 bites of the cherry, and I think that's well appreciated. The alternative, of course, is the wider impact of the huge amount of activity and showcasing that to the world. But on a national scale, and I compare it with Ryder Cup, as you know, people are staying all over central Scotland to attend an event that takes 45,000 people a day. An event of the scale of Armed Forces Day plus Bannockburn Live plus Pipe Fest should mean that the whole of central Scotland will benefit considerably over that weekend. And we're working with partners to ensure that we maximise on that opportunity.
And Margaret McDougall.
Thank you. I will be very brief. Could you just clarify that the change in the Bannockburn programme was due to an early indication of low ticket sales, around 1,000 out of the 45,000, and that's why that was?
No. Well, the 45,000. The 45,000 is effectively erroneous, as I've explained. This event is quite different in terms of the scale. It can only take 10,000 people a day. But the reason for moving from the Monday was primarily because of the imbalance of demand. The demand was to come on the Saturday and the Sunday, and not on the Monday. So the trick was to encourage these people to come on the Saturday and Sunday and extend the programme, which is why we're so confident that anyone coming to Bannockburn Live on the Saturday and Sunday will have a great time. And we hope it's everybody here.
And those early ticket figures were in no way surprising at all. This is a completely new event. We would anticipate that people don't know what it is. The fact that the King's ticket sold out so quickly and so absolutely is because there is a perceived demand for that, because it's a limited number. people buy tickets when they're hot. When they think they're hot, it's because they think it's going to sell out. This is a new thing.
The change in programme was due to the lack of demand for the Monday, and that's therefore you changed that to suit people who obviously
we had to. When you reduce the capacity due to expectation, because there is a competition from a free event, you have to redraw the budget. The ticket income is a significant part of that budget. So you have to, if you predict that perhaps there are less tickets likely to be sold because there's a free event on, then you reduce. So you have to reduce the expenditure. It's simple.
The Monday wasn't popular anyway, so that's why it was.
No, the Monday wasn't popular, and it has.
It may have become popular. That wasn't put to the test. Monday was less popular than the other 2 days, not surprisingly.
There are a lot of children's activities going on, and yet children's tickets are £12.50. Is there any thought given to family tickets, or how to attract children? Carla?
There are family tickets available, yes. And in fact, when we took over the project, we amended the pricing, because previously it was kids under 2 went free, now it's kids under 5 go free.
But the musical lineup is superb. It's so superb that Brian Ferguson from the Scotsman even had to accept that it was a superb lineup. So there.
And that family ticket that we have is cheaper than comparable events in Scotland. Much cheaper.
Yeah. Can I just ask lastly, one thing we've not talked about very much is the programme for the Monday, the Clan Day. Very briefly, what's happening on the Monday?
Exclusive event for the clan participants, those clans that are taking pictures at Bannockburn Live, and it's really intended as a thank you to them for their participation in the event. So it's based on exclusive access to the Bannockburn Visitor Centre, thanks to National Trust for Scotland, some entertainment, chance for them to network, to catch up with their friends, just a kind of fairly low-key thank you, and just to show our appreciation for their involvement.
Thank you. I think that concludes our session. I'm very grateful to you all for coming along and sharing your views. I think I would speak for all the committee members when we say we wish you every success, both with Bannockburn Live and indeed with Armed Forces Day. Speaking as somebody who represents Stirling, I do hope it does turn out to fulfil all the expectations for the local community and for the local economy. And we look forward to seeing that spike in ticket sales later this week, subsequent to your appearance at the committee. Thank you all very much, and the committee will now go into private session. Thank you.